Hey everyone. Welcome back to Arcane Paradox. Get ready for an amazing tale. Veela Council summoned Harry age 8 after Mate-Call and found 38 blocks placed by Headmaster. Smash that like button and subscribe for more. Here we go. Chapter 1, The Call. The sound came at 3:14 in the morning. It moved through the Veela Council's ancestral seat in the Provençal hills like a shockwave through still water, not loud, not sharp, but felt, the way you feel a thunderclap in your sternum before you actually hear it. Every Veela within the estate woke at the same moment. Some sat up in bed, breathing hard, hands pressed flat against their chests as if checking their own heartbeats. Others were already on their feet before their eyes were fully open, pulled upright by something that bypassed conscious thought entirely. In the highest tower of the Chateau Lumineuse, Grand Matriarch Seraphine Voss was already standing at her window when the second wave hit. It was stronger. It always was, with a true Mate-Call. The first pulse was the signal. The second was the claim. Seraphine was 73 years old and had served the Veela nation for 50 of those years in one capacity or another. She had felt 3 Mate-Calls in her lifetime, genuine ones, not the manufactured approximations that young Veela sometimes produced when they were being dramatic about boys, and each one had carried its own distinct flavor, its own particular emotional signature. Love calls tended toward warmth, golden and expansive. Desperation calls burned cold. Protection calls rattled your bones. This one felt like all 3 at once, and underneath them all was something she hadn't encountered in half a century of service. Rage. Not adult rage, either. Not the calculated, weaponized fury of someone who had chosen anger as a tool. This was the pure, unfiltered rage of a child who had been hurting for a very long time and had only just, in some deep and wordless part of themselves, decided that they were done with it. Seraphine pressed one elegant hand against the cold glass of her window and stared out at the dark hills. The lavender fields below the estate were moving, though there was no wind, the stalks bending and shivering in patterns that had nothing to do with weather. Matriarch. She didn't turn around. She'd heard the door open 20 seconds ago. I know. Apolline Delacour stepped into the room. She was 29, still in her sleeping clothes, her silver blonde hair loose around her shoulders, and she was one of the very few people in the world who walked into Seraphine Voss's private chambers without knocking and didn't apologize for it. She was also the head of the council's investigative branch, which meant that when unexplained magical events shook them all out of their beds at 3 in the morning, she was the person responsible for finding out why. It's a child, Apolline said. Not a question. Yes. Young. Very young. Apolline moved to stand beside her at the window. Her blue eyes, a shade darker than most full Veela, which was part of what made her so unreadable to people who didn't know her, were fixed on the horizon, tracking something Seraphine couldn't quite feel anymore. The investigative gifts dulled with age. 7 or 8, I would say. Maybe younger. The call is undirected, they don't know they're doing it. Which means their mate doesn't know either, Seraphine said. Which means, Apolline said, with the particular precision she always used when she was being very careful with her words, that the child is in distress significant enough to trigger an involuntary Mate-Call, and has been in that distress for long enough that their magic has built up sufficient pressure to reach us across a very considerable distance. Seraphine finally turned to look at her. How considerable? I'm estimating Northern Europe. Possibly Britain. Apolline paused. I need a tracking team and I need to leave before dawn. You're already planning the roster. I've been planning it since I woke up. She said it without apology, because Apolline Delacour very rarely apologized for being competent. Céline, Mireille, and Bertrand for the investigative work. Healer Fontaine because if this child is in the state I think they're in, we'll need her before we need anyone else. And I want to go in quiet. No council banners, no formal delegation robes. Whatever's happening to this child, I don't want to make it worse by arriving like a political event. Seraphine studied her for a long moment. The lavender fields had gone still again below them, but the night felt charged, expectant. Like the moment after lightning and before thunder. You think someone did this, Seraphine said slowly. You think someone caused the distress. Deliberately. Apolline's jaw tightened, just slightly. I think a child of 7 or 8 years old doesn't build up enough suppressed magical anguish to send a mate call across the channel by accident. She let that sit in the air between them. I think we should find out. Seraphine turned back to the window. After a long moment, she said, take your team. Report directly to me when you know the situation. Do not, she paused carefully, act on anything without council authorization. Whatever you find. It wasn't an agreement, exactly. But Apolline had been working for Seraphine long enough to know it was as close to one as she was going to get at 3:15 in the morning, so she took it. Of course, she said, and left. They landed outside a place called Little Whinging at 6:43 in the morning, which was late enough for the summer sun to be already properly up and early enough that the streets were mostly quiet. Apolline had brought them to a park 2 streets over from the address her tracking spell had pulled, a neat rectangle of manicured grass with a children's play structure that looked like it had never actually been played on, and now she stood on the pavement with her team fanned out behind her and looked at the row of identical houses. Number 4 stood out from its neighbors in no way that she could point to. Same brick, same neat garden, same curtains drawn against the morning light. But something about it made the investigative instinct in her chest pull tight and sharp, the way a fishing line went taut when something was caught below the water. There, she said quietly. Celine moved up beside her. She was 40-something, with the close-cropped silver hair that full Veela often developed after their first century, and she had the best detection gift of anyone on the team. She stood very still for a moment, head slightly tilted, like a musician listening for an off note. Then she hissed through her teeth. Apolline. I know. No, I don't think you, Celine stopped. Started again. There are blocks on that house. Magical suppression. A lot of them. I can feel them from here. How many? Celine was quiet for another moment. Then she shook her head. I need to be closer. But, a lot. More than I've ever felt on a single location. She looked at Apolline. More than I've ever felt on a person. That sat there between all 5 of them, heavy and sharp-edged. Healer Fontaine, who was a small, calm woman who had been a Veela combat medic during the last great territorial dispute in the Balkans and had therefore seen most of the worst things the magical world could produce, folded her arms and said, then we'd better go in. Apolline nodded. She straightened her jacket, she dressed in muggle clothes, grey trousers and a pale blue blouse that looked entirely ordinary to anyone on the street, and walked up the front path of number 4, Privet Drive, and knocked on the door. There was a long pause. Then the sound of heavy footsteps, and the door opened. The man who answered was enormous, not in a powerful way, in the way of someone who had grown soft around a hard core of meanness, like a stone that had accumulated mud. He had a thick mustache, small eyes that were already unfriendly before they'd quite focused on her, and he was wearing a dressing gown that looked expensive and had never been a good idea. Yes. He said, and managed to make even that single syllable sound like a challenge. Apolline smiled at him. The professional smile, the one she wore in council chambers and across negotiating tables and in situations where what she actually felt was not something she intended to show. Good morning. I'm looking for a child. I believe he lives here. The man's small eyes went through several rapid changes. Surprise. Wariness. Something uglier underneath both. Don't know what you're talking about. The boy, Apolline said pleasantly. Dark hair. Green eyes. I'm told he would be about 7 or 8 years old. The shift in the man's expression was infinitesimal, but Apolline had spent 15 years reading people for a living. She saw it. The fractional tightening around his eyes. The way his hand gripped the door frame just slightly harder. There's no, he started. Vernon. The woman who appeared behind him was thin where he was large, with a neck that reminded Apolline uncomfortably of a bird, and eyes that were doing what frightened people's eyes always did, flickering between the threat and the exits. "Vernon, let them in." "Petunia, let them in," the woman said, in a voice that was trying very hard to stay level and mostly managing it. Vernon Dursley stood aside. Apolline walked into the house, and the first thing she felt, stepping over the threshold, was the blocks. They hit her like walking through cold water, a sudden oppressive pressure, a wrongness that settled over her skin like something trying to push her back. Her team felt it too. She heard Mireille make a sharp, involuntary sound behind her. Céline had her hand out, fingers spread, as if she could physically measure the weight of the suppression in the air. "Mon Dieu," Mireille whispered. She was the youngest of them, only 26, and her voice had gone hollow with something between awe and horror. The Dursley woman, Petunia, was watching them with the expression of someone who had been waiting for something terrible to happen for a very long time and was half relieved and half devastated that it was finally here. "He's upstairs," Petunia said quietly. "The cupboard under the—" She stopped. Swallowed. "He sleeps upstairs. Second door." Apolline looked at her for a moment. Just long enough to let Petunia understand that the correction hadn't gone unnoticed, that Apolline had caught what she'd almost said and filed it away precisely where it would cause the most damage later. Then she turned and went upstairs. The room was small, and it looked like a storage space that had been recently and hastily converted. There was still a lock on the outside of the door, the kind of lock that made no sense on a bedroom unless the person sleeping inside wasn't meant to be able to leave. Apolline's hand hovered over it for a second, feeling the residue of it, and then she opened the door. The child was awake. That was the first thing she registered. He was sitting up in his bed, knees drawn to his chest, and he was watching the door with an expression that she recognized from years of investigative work in situations involving children who had learned that adults coming through doors was not generally a good development. He had black hair that went in every direction and enormous green eyes behind glasses that were slightly too large for his face, one of the arms held together with what appeared to be a piece of sellotape. He was small, too small, Hilaire Fontaine would say later, reviewing his physical state, at least 4 centimeters below where he should be for his age, and underweight in the way that suggested this was not a recent problem, but his eyes were not small at all. They were watchful and sharp, and there was something in them that Apolline could feel as well as see. Magic. Enormous, complicated, suffocating magic, pressing against its own suppression from the inside. She understood, standing there in the doorway of that small room with its single bed and its hand-me-down furniture and its lock on the outside, exactly what she was looking at. She'd known it since Céline's sharp hiss on the pavement outside. But knowing it and seeing it, seeing this child, this specific small human person sitting up in his too small bed watching her with eyes that had learned wariness before they'd learned trust, made something in her chest do something complicated and furious. She kept her face calm. She was good at that. "Good morning," she said, in English. Her accent was pronounced but her English was precise. "My name is Apolline. I work with an organization that monitors unusual magical activity." She paused. "You had quite an active night." The boy blinked at her. His voice, when it came, was careful. "Your magic." "Yes. You felt it." "The whole of southern France felt it," she said, and because she was watching him closely she saw the exact moment he understood what she meant, the slight widening of his eyes, the flicker of something across his face that was not quite alarm and not quite satisfaction. "What's your name?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then, as if deciding something, he said, "Harry. Harry Potter." Behind her, she heard Céline make a soft sound. Mireille said something in French that Apolline chose not to repeat. Apolline herself didn't let anything show on her face, because Harry Potter was looking at her very intently and she had the sudden strong impression that this child was better at reading people than most adults gave him credit for. "Harry," she said. "Do you know what happened last night? What you did?" "I dreamed something," he said slowly. "It felt real. Like calling out. I didn't mean to do anything. I never mean to do things, they just, he stopped himself. There it was, the reflex. The practiced self-editing of a child who had learned that accidentally doing things led to consequences. It's all right, Apolline said. What you did wasn't wrong. It was actually, she paused, choosing the word carefully, very impressive, for someone your age. For someone any age, truthfully. Harry looked at her with the expression of a child who had been told they were impressive before, usually by adults who were about to explain why impressive was actually a problem. What organization? He asked. You said you work for an organization. She almost smiled. She did, a little. The Veela Council. Have you heard of it? He shook his head. You will, she said. She took a step into the room, unhurried, giving him time to read her body language and find nothing threatening in it. Harry, I need to ask you something and I need you to try to be very honest with me, even though we've only just met. She crouched down so she was at his eye level, which was something she did with her own daughter when she needed her to understand she was being serious. Has anyone ever done anything to your magic? Tried to change it, or quiet it, or make it harder for you to reach? The look on his face answered before his words did. It wasn't confusion, wasn't the blank incomprehension that would have met that question from a child who had no frame of reference for it. It was recognition, immediate, sharp-edged recognition, overlaid with something that might have been relief and might have been the beginning of anger. Everything feels like it's behind glass, he said quietly. Like I can see it but I can't touch it. Has been since, he frowned. Always, I think. I always thought everyone felt like that. They don't, Apolline said. He absorbed that. She watched him absorb it, watched him turn it over and examine it from several angles, and thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that this child was going to be something genuinely remarkable once someone let him be. What's behind the glass? She asked. Harry looked down at his hands. They were thin, with bitten-down nails, and there was an old scar on his left palm that Healer Fontaine would later have questions about. I don't know, he said. But sometimes it pushes. And last night it pushed really hard and I think I made something happen, only I don't know what. I do, Apolline said. She made a decision, the kind she made sometimes, quickly, on instinct, that occasionally got her into arguments with Seraphine and occasionally turned out to be the best call she'd ever made and sometimes both simultaneously. Harry, how would you feel about coming with us? We need to properly assess what's been done to your magic. To find out what's behind the glass. Done to me? He said, very quietly. Yes. He looked at his hands again. Then at the door with the lock on the outside. Am I coming back here after? The honest answer was that she didn't know yet, because council procedures required that she assess the situation before making any promises, and Seraphine had explicitly told her not to act without authorization. The other answer, the one that her chest produced instantly, without consulting her professional judgment at all, was absolutely not, this child is not coming back to this house. She split the difference. We'll discuss that, she said, which was honest, at least. Harry looked at her one more time with those sharp, assessing eyes. Then he said, let me get my shoes, which was apparently his version of yes. What happened in the sitting room of number 4, Privet Drive over the next 40 minutes was not loud. Apolline had a talent for conducting devastating conversations at a perfectly ordinary conversational volume, and she exercised it fully. Vernon Dursley attempted bluster twice and fell silent both times when she looked at him without blinking and waited for him to finish, which was somehow more effective than anything louder would have been. Petunia Dursley sat very still in an armchair and said almost nothing, which Apolline found more interesting than Vernon's noise. What she learned, in pieces, across that conversation, Harry had lived in this house since the age of 15 months. His parents were dead, killed, she knew already, by Voldemort, though the Dursleys said, the accident, with the particular determination of people who have decided a thing is true by refusing to say anything else. His bedroom had until recently been the cupboard under the stairs. He had been told, repeatedly and in various ways, that magic was not real and that anything unusual that happened around him was his fault and a problem. "He's uncontrollable," Vernon said, at one point, as if this were an explanation rather than a confession. "He's 8 years old," Apolline said, without heat, which was almost worse. By the time Bertrand, who had been conducting his own quiet investigation of the house's magical residue while the Dursleys were occupied, appeared in the doorway and gave her the look that meant "we need to talk," she had a fairly complete picture. Not every detail. Not everything that had happened in this house over 8 years. But enough. She stood. "Harry," she said, "would you wait in the hallway for a moment?" Harry, who had been sitting in the corner of the room with his shoes on and his hands folded in his lap with the practiced stillness of a child who had learned not to take up too much space, got up without argument and went into the hallway. Apolline watched him go, then turned to look at Bertrand. He crooked his finger. She followed him into the kitchen, out of earshot. "The lock on the bedroom door," Bertrand said quietly. He was a careful man who did not exaggerate, ever, and his face right now was doing something she rarely saw it do, which was show anger. "It's been used. Regularly. The magical residue on it goes back at least 5 years. Apolline nodded once. "And there's more." He was quiet for a moment. "The blocks on the child, Apolline. I got close enough to start mapping them while you were talking. I counted," he stopped himself, as if checking the number again internally. "I counted 38 distinct suppression matrices." She was quiet for a long moment. From the sitting room came the low sound of Vernon attempting to explain something to Mireille, who was not responding. 38, she repeated. "Stacked. Layered. Some of them are interlocking, they reinforce each other. I've never seen anything like it. The craft is extraordinary. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing." His jaw was tight. "And every single one of them carries the same magical signature." "Tell me." "Albus Dumbledore." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the window, the suburban street was coming to life, a car passing, a dog being walked, the distant sound of a lawnmower, all of it mundane and ordinary and completely indifferent to the fact that Apolline Delacour was standing in this kitchen having her understanding of at least one very powerful man revised at speed. "All 38, she said. "All 38. She breathed out slowly. "Pull everything you can. I want documentation. I want the magical equivalent of a paper trail, timestamps, matrices, the works. I want everything recorded before we move him, because we are absolutely going to need it." "Already started," Bertrand said. She went back into the hallway. Harry was standing by the front door, looking at nothing in particular, and when she came back he turned and looked at her with those watchful green eyes. There was a quality to his stillness that she'd noticed since she first saw him, not the stillness of a frightened child frozen in place, but something more deliberate. As if he were taking everything in and deciding what to do with it. "Ready?" she said. "Yes," he said. "Then, am I in trouble?" "No," she said, and meant it completely. "Harry, you are absolutely not in trouble." He considered this. "Are they?" He tilted his head toward the sitting room. Apolline paused for just a fraction of a second. "That's for other people to determine," she said, which was both true and not an answer, which Harry seemed to recognize because one corner of his mouth moved very slightly. "So yes," he said. She didn't reply to that. She just opened the front door and held it, and after a brief moment, Harry Potter walked out of number 4, Privet Drive. He didn't look back. They apparat to a waypoint outside Calais, a Veela safe house, technically a farmhouse that looked unremarkable from the outside and was warded within an inch of its life from the inside, because Apolline wanted to do an initial assessment before bringing the child to Chateau Lumineuse, where Seraphine would immediately start running political calculations. Healer Fontaine did the physical check first, which Harry bore with the kind of cooperative detachment that came from expecting results and not expecting anyone to do anything about them. She moved through her diagnostic spells with quiet efficiency, and the list she compiled, quietly, professionally, her face carefully neutral the way trained healers kept their faces neutral, was a document that Apolline would later have to make herself read in full without putting it down. When it was done, Fontaine came to find Apolline in the farmhouse kitchen, where she was standing with a cup of coffee she hadn't drunk. Physically, Fontaine said, "He's functional. Nothing acute. But the cumulative picture, the nutritional deficiencies, the stress markers, the old healed injuries, this has been happening for a long time. Years." "I know. I don't think you do know, fully," Fontaine said, very quietly. "Because the physical picture is one thing. But Apolline, his magical system," she stopped. Collected herself. "You know how a stream looks when it's been dammed? The pressure, the pooling. Multiply that by about 10 years of consistent suppression and then imagine the dam is artificial, deliberately constructed, and add 37 more dams on top of the first one." 38, Apolline said. "Yes. And the deepest ones are almost structural at this point, they've been there so long his magical core has been developing around them. When we remove them," she looked at Apolline steadily. "When we remove them, we need to be very careful. And very ready. Because what comes out is going to be significant." "How significant?" Fontaine picked her words with care. "He sent a mate call across the channel. Involuntarily. In his sleep. With 38 blocks in place." She let that sentence stand alone for a moment. "So. Very." Apolline set down the coffee cup. "And his mate?" The call's signature was very specific. "Close in age, I'd say 8 to 10, given the resonance pattern." Fontaine glanced toward the door, beyond which Harry was sitting at a table with Mireille, who had discovered that Harry had never played Exploding Snap and was now apparently making this her personal mission to remedy. "There'll be a Veela child somewhere who's been feeling something strange since 3 this morning and can't explain it." Apolline already knew. She'd known since she triangulated the call in the car on the way to Little Whinging. She hadn't said anything yet, because there were about 7 different conversations that needed to happen before she could productively address the implications, and 3 of them needed to happen with her own daughter. "One thing at a time," she said. She went back into the main room. Harry had learned the basics of Exploding Snap in what appeared to have been about 4 minutes and was now beating Mireille with the focused attention of someone who had decided that if a thing was worth doing, it was worth doing properly. Mireille was trying not to look impressed and mostly failing. "Harry," Apolline said, and sat down across from him at the table. He looked up from his cards. "Do you want me to explain what's happening to you? Properly, I mean. Not a simplified version." He looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said, as if this should have been obvious, because to him it apparently was. So she told him. She told him about Veela, about mate calls, about what his magic had done in the night and why they'd felt it. She told him about the blocks, all 38 of them, and what it meant that they were there, and who had put them there. She kept her voice level and informational and she watched his face through all of it. He went very still when she said Dumbledore's name. Not surprised, Harry Potter, she was learning, very rarely looked surprised, which was itself a kind of information. Something more complicated than surprise. Something that looked like a piece clicking into place in a puzzle he'd been working on for years without quite knowing what the picture was supposed to be. "He came to the house," Harry said. "Once. When I was really little. I don't remember it properly, I was maybe 3, I think. But Aunt Petunia mentioned it once, by accident. She said an old man came and checked on me and told her I was where I needed to be." He was quiet for a moment. "I thought she meant the social services people." Apolline breathed carefully through her nose. "No," she said. "Not the social services people." "What does it feel like," Harry asked, "when you take them off?" "The blocks. We haven't done it yet. We'll do it properly, at the chateau, with a full medical team and time and space." She paused. But from what I understand, it's different for everyone. Some people describe it as something loosening. Some describe it as heat. She looked at him. You might feel quite different afterward. Harry thought about this seriously. Then he said, different how? More like yourself, Apolline said. Something moved across Harry's face that was not quite any single emotion, too complicated for that, too layered. He looked down at his hands again for a moment. Then he picked up his exploding snap cards and said, okay. Which was, Apolline was beginning to understand, exactly how Harry Potter handled things that were enormous and complicated and should probably be cried about. He looked at them fully, absorbed them, and then said okay and picked up the cards. She suspected this habit had been learned in a very specific, very difficult school, and she suspected that someday, when there was time and space for it, the OK was going to crack open and something much bigger was going to come out of it. But not today. They reached Chateau Lumineuse at 2:30 in the afternoon, coming in through the estate's eastern approach, which was the route that bypassed the main courtyard and the visitor reception hall and the 3 administrative offices through which Seraphine always seemed to know immediately when anyone arrived. It didn't work. It never worked. Seraphine was waiting in the corridor outside the medical wing with the expression of someone who had been efficiently running an organization for 30 years and had not the slightest intention of being managed by someone who reported to her. She looked at Harry. Harry looked back at her. Seraphine Voss was not a small woman, she was tall, straight-backed, white-haired, with the particular presence of someone who had spent decades in a position of authority and had the bone-deep certainty of it. She wore it like armor, that certainty. It made most people feel slightly less substantial in her presence. Like they took up less space than they'd thought. Harry Potter, who had been taking up too little space for 8 years and had apparently decided somewhere between Privet Drive and Calais that he was done with that, looked back at her with steady green eyes and did not shrink even slightly. Seraphine blinked. Just once. But Apolline saw it. Harry, Apolline said, this is Grand Matriarch Seraphine Voss. She leads the Veela Council. Seraphine, this is Harry Potter. I know who he is, Seraphine said. Her English was impeccable and carried absolutely no warmth. We should speak, Apolline. Before anything else happens. After the initial assessment, Apolline said. I said before, and I said after, Apolline said, with the particular pleasantness she deployed when she intended to win an argument and wanted to make sure no one could call it uncivil. Harry needs to be seen by the more actions request aborted right the next chapter now. Chapter 2, 38 Healer Fontaine's medical wing occupied the entire east face of Chateau Lumineuse's ground floor, and it was nothing like the sparse, clinical spaces Harry had occasionally glimpsed in television programs through the gap under the cupboard door. The walls were warm stone, the light came from floating orbs that adjusted their brightness based on what was happening in the room, and the ceiling was high enough that the space never felt cramped even when it was full of people. Harry sat on the edge of the examination table and looked at all of it with the particular attention he gave to new places, cataloging exits, reading the room's emotional temperature, figuring out who actually made the decisions and who only thought they did. He'd learned to do this young. At Privet Drive it had been survival. Here, he suspected it was just going to be interesting. There were 6 people in the room besides himself, Apolline, who had stationed herself near the door with her arms folded and the expression of someone guarding a perimeter, Healer Fontaine, who was arranging things on a tray with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times, Celine, the silver-haired woman who kept tilting her head slightly like she was listening to something just outside the range of normal hearing, Bertrand, who had a leather folio open and was writing in it with a speed that suggested he was getting a great deal of information from somewhere, and 2 younger healers whose names Harry hadn't caught yet, moving quietly in the background. And then there was the girl. She'd been there when they came in, sitting in a chair against the wall with her arms folded and her chin up, silver blonde hair pulled back in a braid that was starting to come loose, wearing an expression that Harry could only describe as aggressively prepared. She looked about his age, maybe a year older, and she was watching him with an intensity that was different from everyone else's. Everyone else was watching him with varying degrees of professional concern, political calculation, or careful kindness. She was watching him like he was a problem she was working out. He'd looked at her twice and both times she'd looked away immediately and then looked back the moment he wasn't watching, which he'd noticed because he was always watching. "Who's that?" he'd asked Apolline quietly, on the way in. Apolline had done something with her face that was there and gone too quickly to read. "That's my daughter," she'd said. Fleur. Harry filed this away. Now Healer Fontaine set down whatever she'd been arranging and turned to look at him properly. "Harry. I'm going to explain everything before I do it. Nothing happens without your agreement." "Yes." "Yes," Harry said. "Good. What we're going to do today is map the blocks on your magical core. All of them. We'll document their structure, their ordering, their interlocking points. Then we'll begin removal, but carefully, sequentially, starting from the outermost layer. We won't rush it." She paused. "It may feel strange. It may feel like a great deal is happening at once. But at no point will you be in danger. Do you understand?" "Yes," Harry said. "Then, how long will it take to remove all 38? She considered. "Not today. We'll remove what we safely can today and continue tomorrow. The deepest blocks are structural at this point. Will need to be measured." Harry thought about this. "And while they're still there, the blocks, can I feel them?" Fontaine tilted her head. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he paused, trying to find the right words. He didn't have a lot of practice at this, describing things he felt internally. The Dursleys had not been interested. "It feels like pressure. Constant pressure. Like being squeezed, but from the inside. I thought it was just how things felt. Normally." The room had gone very quiet. Not the absence of noise kind of quiet, the kind where everyone has stopped breathing slightly. "No," Fontaine said, very gently. "That's not how things feel normally." Harry nodded once. "Okay," he said. "Let's start." The mapping took 40 minutes, and it looked from the outside like nothing much, Harry sitting still, Fontaine moving her wand in slow careful arcs, diagrams building themselves in luminous lines above the examination table like architectural drawings made of light. But Bertrand was writing almost continuously, and at some point Celine made a sharp sound and had to leave the room briefly and came back with her face composed but her hands not entirely steady. Harry watched the diagrams form above him with the same focused attention he'd given to Mireille's exploding snap cards. He couldn't understand all of it, the magical notation meant nothing to him yet, but he could see the structure. Layer over layer over layer, some interlocking, some running parallel, a few that seemed almost architectural in their complexity. A cage built over years, each bar added with precision. "The first one is the oldest," Fontaine said quietly, as the outermost diagram pulsed gold. 15 months, I'd estimate." "That's," Apolline stopped herself. "When his parents died," Harry said. "When I went to my aunt's." He said it flat, informational, because that was what it was, information. He'd learned a long time ago that attaching too much weight to facts didn't change the facts, it just made them harder to carry. His parents were dead and he'd been 15 months old and someone had put the first block on him before he was old enough to walk properly. That was the fact of it. He looked at it directly and filed it. Fontaine held his gaze for a moment, her professional calm doing something complicated. Then she nodded. "We'll start with the 3 outermost layers. They're the least structurally complex, and removing them will give your core a chance to begin to decompress." She paused. "Ready?" "Yes," Harry said. The first block came off like a held breath releasing. That was the only way he could describe it afterward, like a breath he hadn't known he was holding, somewhere deep inside, suddenly let go. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't hurt. It was just, more. Like a room he'd thought was the whole building turning out to have a door he'd never noticed, and the door opened onto more room, and more light. He breathed in. The air tasted different. Okay? Fontaine asked. Yeah, Harry said. He looked at his hands. They looked the same. But they felt different. Connected to something more. Yeah, do the next one. The second block came off with a sound. Not a loud sound, Fontaine heard it as a soft percussion, like a book dropped on carpet from a short distance, and both assistant healers looked up simultaneously. But Harry felt it as something rolling through him from his center outward, a slow warm wave that made every muscle in his body unclench at once in a way that told him he'd been clenching without knowing it. He gripped the edge of the examination table. Still okay? Fontaine asked, watching his face carefully. Yes, Harry said. His voice had changed slightly. Not in pitch, just in the quality of it, the way a sound changes when you remove acoustic insulation from around it. Less muffled. More present. Keep going. The third block was more complex. Fontaine worked at it for several minutes before it yielded, and when it did, the luminous diagrams above the table flared so brightly that both assistant healers stepped back from instinct. The light that came from Harry was not visible light exactly, it was more that the room's floating orbs stuttered and brightened in response, as if something had just raised the ambient magical pressure of the space. Harry sat very still in the center of it and breathed. Harry. Apolline had moved away from the door without him noticing. She was standing just off to his right, her voice careful. How do you feel? He thought about that honestly. He tried to find the right word for the way he felt, with 3 blocks removed out of 38, with the pressure still there but minutely, just minutely, reduced, and his magic reaching into that small new space like a plant reaching toward light. Angry, he said. The room was quiet. Not at you, he added, which was the truth. At whoever decided I should feel like that for 8 years. He said it without heat, with the flat steadiness of someone who has decided a thing is unacceptable and intends to be very clear about it. I want them all off. We'll get them all off, Apolline said. Every one. They stopped at 7 that evening, having removed 8 blocks total. Fontaine had called a halt not because Harry wanted to stop. Harry, to the increasing amazement of everyone in the room, showed no sign of wanting to stop, but because the structural blocks below layer 8 were, in her professional judgment, complex enough to require her to be at her best, and she was not at her best past 7 in the evening. She was human, even if her patient increasingly seemed to be something rather more than that. Harry was moved to a room in the residential wing, a real room, with a real bed and a window that looked out over the lavender fields and a bookcase stocked with texts. He immediately began investigating with the intensity of someone recently given access to a resource they'd been denied for years. Apolline stayed long enough to make sure he'd eaten, and was almost out the door when he said, without looking up from the book, "Your daughter." She paused. Yes. She was in the room the whole time. He looked up then. She wasn't supposed to be, was she? Apolline was quiet for a moment. No, she said. She wasn't. How did she get past the matriarch? Fleur, Apolline said, with the tone of someone who had been asking themselves this question in various forms for 9 years, has a talent for being places she isn't supposed to be and having entirely valid explanations for why she's there. Harry considered this. I like her, he said, as simply as he might have said the lavender smells good, as pure observation, and went back to his book. Apolline stood in the doorway for a moment looking at him. Then she went to find her daughter and have the conversation she'd been building up to since 6:43 that morning. Fleur was in the garden below Harry's window, which was either coincidental or wasn't, and from the way she was sitting, on the low stone wall with her legs dangling, facing the window, Apolline was fairly certain it wasn't. She sat down beside her. He saw me watching, Fleur said immediately, not waiting to be asked. In the medical wing. He noticed every time I looked at him. I know. He noticed things no one else noticed. He noticed that Celine left the room and came back and that her hands were shaking. He noticed when Bertrand ran out of space on one page of his folio and had to turn it over. Fleur was quiet for a moment. He was scared the whole time and it didn't show at all. Apolline looked at her daughter. 9 years old, silver blonde, with her father's eyes and Apolline's instincts and a personality that had been a magnificent force of nature since the day she arrived in the world. She was sitting on the garden wall doing what she always did when she was processing something, talking it out, because Fleur's brain worked best when her mouth was involved. "Maman," Fleur said. "Yes. Is it him?" Apolline was quiet for a moment. There were several answers to this question and they were all true and they all had different implications, and this conversation had been inevitable since roughly 3:30 this morning, and she'd had all day to figure out how she wanted to have it and she still wasn't entirely sure. "The call came from him," she said carefully. "The resonance profile of the call matches the profile I was shown at my own bonding assessment, the one generated by a genuine Mate-Call." She paused. "So the technical answer is yes." Fleur looked at the window above them. The light inside was warm and steady. "He doesn't know," she said. "No. Does he know anything? About Veela bonds? About what a Mate-Call means?" "Not yet. We told him about the Veela today. We told him about the blocks and what they were. The bond," Apolline measured her words, "is something we'll discuss when he's more stable. When more of the blocks are off and he can be more fully himself in the conversation." She looked at her daughter. "How do you feel?" Fleur thought about this with the seriousness she brought to things that mattered to her, which was distinctive from her general manner, which was theatrical. When Fleur was being serious she was very still and the theatrics went completely away. "Weird," she said finally. "Like I've been waiting for something without knowing I was waiting. And now the thing is here and I don't know what to do with it, which I hate." "You don't have to do anything with it," Apolline said. "I know that." Fleur's tone suggested this was not actually the comfort her mother intended it to be. "Maman. He had 38 blocks on him." 38. "And someone put them there." "Yes. And that someone, Fleur, is Albus Dumbledore, who everyone in magical Britain thinks is the greatest wizard alive, Fleur. And who put those things on a 15-month-old baby, Fleur." Her daughter stopped. Breathed. The garden was fragrant and full of insects in the warm evening air, and above them the window light was steady. "Sorry," Fleur said. She wasn't, particularly, but she recognized when she was running ahead of the information. I know," Apolline said. "He's going to be," Fleur stopped again. She said the next part in French, which she did when she was being very honest about something. "When the rest of the blocks come off, he's going to be extraordinary. Isn't he?" "Yes," Apolline said simply. Fleur nodded, as if confirming something to herself. "Good," she said. "He should be. He's had enough of not being." She hopped off the wall and went inside, which was Fleur's way of ending conversations, not rudely, just definitively, once she'd gotten what she came for. Apolline stayed on the wall a little longer in the warm evening, looking up at Harry's window, thinking about Seraphine and Dumbledore and the 30 blocks that were still in place and the conversation she needed to have with the council tomorrow, and about a 9-year-old girl sitting in a medical room she wasn't supposed to be in, watching a boy she'd been looking for without knowing it. Morning came fast and bright, and Harry was awake before anyone else because Harry was apparently always awake early, which Apolline noted when she came to check on him at 6 and found him sitting cross-legged on his bed with 2 books open and a piece of paper covered in what appeared to be self-generated diagrams of the block structures she'd had Bertrand summarize for him the night before. "You've been up since," she started. "4," he said. "I couldn't sleep past that. Too much." He tapped the side of his head, which she understood to mean his magic, the new space in it, the fact that it had been pressing against those outermost blocks all night and was now discovering, incrementally, what it could reach. "It's not bad. Just loud. It'll settle," she said. As more come off. He looked at her. We're doing more today. Yes. Fontaine wants to start at 8. He nodded and went back to his diagrams. She looked at the paper in his hand, the structural mapping he'd drawn from memory, the interlocking matrices rendered in pencil with the kind of spatial accuracy that should not have been possible without magical training, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the diagram didn't already say better. Fontaine worked through 10 more blocks in the morning session, and this time there was a small audience for it. Not Seraphine. Apolline had specifically ensured Seraphine had a schedule conflict, but several council investigators who had legitimate professional reasons to be observing, and Fleur, who appeared in the doorway 10 minutes in and was apparently not going to be removed by anyone, and so was not. Each block that came off now was more significant than the last, because the structural ones were becoming accessible and each removal was no longer just a loosening, it was more like the dismantling of load-bearing architecture, done with extraordinary care, watched from every angle. By the time they reached the 15th block, the ambient magic in the room was doing things that made the floating light orbs flicker in rhythmic pulses. By the 17th, one of the junior investigators had backed up against the wall without seeming to realize he'd done it. Harry sat at the center of all of it with his eyes open and his breathing steady and his hands flat on his knees, and he was changing. Not dramatically, not in the way of stories, not in a sudden visible transformation. But the quality of his presence was changing, the way a room changes as a fire builds in it, incrementally and then undeniably. Between the 19th and 20th blocks, Fontaine called a 20-minute rest. Harry got off the table and crossed the room to the window, and stood looking out at the lavender fields with his back to everyone, and no one said anything for a while. Fleur appeared beside him, just appeared, silently, because Fleur moved quietly when she wasn't making a point of being noticed, and stood looking at the same view. "Does it hurt?" she asked quietly. "No," Harry said. "It's the opposite of hurt." He was quiet for a moment. "It's like, every time one comes off, I can remember something I couldn't before." Fleur frowned at him. "Remember?" "Not real memories. More like, knowing things I should have always known. About what I can do. About what I am." He looked at his hands against the window frame. "I keep reaching for things and finding them." "What kinds of things?" He glanced at her sidelong. She was watching him with the direct, unfiltered attention of someone who had decided he was interesting and wasn't embarrassed about it. "You were in the room yesterday," he said. "The whole time?" "Yes," she said, without apology. "Your mother said you weren't supposed to be." "She's right," Fleur said serenely. "I've already apologized for it." "Did you mean it?" "Of course not," Fleur said. "I was where I needed to be." She said it matter-of-factly, without any drama, as if this were simply obvious, which to her it appeared to be. "You needed someone in that room who wasn't watching you like a medical case or a political situation. So I was there." Harry was quiet for a moment. Outside, the lavender moved in a slow morning breeze. "Thank you," he said. He didn't make it complicated. It was just true. Something shifted very slightly in Fleur's expression, the prepared, braced quality of it relaxing by some small increment. "You're welcome," she said. Fontaine called them back. The 20th block came off with a sound like a thunderclap that no one in the room had expected. It wasn't dangerous, Fontaine checked immediately, running her diagnostic wand over Harry in a quick sweep and finding everything stable, but it left everyone's ears ringing slightly and the wall sconces blazing at double their usual brightness and one of the investigative folios blown off a desk it had been sitting on. Harry looked up at the ceiling. Something in his face had changed, the watchfulness was still there, absolutely, but there was something underneath it now that hadn't been before. Not confidence, exactly. More like the lack of the thing that had been pushing confidence down. "How many left?" he asked. 18, Fontaine said. "Today." "We'll see how you're doing, I want to keep going," Harry said. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't petulant or pressured. It was just very clear, the way Harry's statements increasingly were, like stones dropped into still water, going where they went and not apologizing for the ripple. I've had them for 8 years. I'd like to not have them anymore. Fontaine looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Apolline. Then she looked back at Harry. 10 more today, she said. Then we rest. The last 8 are the deepest and the oldest and they need their own session. Harry nodded once. Okay, he said. Let's go. They went. By the 30th block, the room had emptied of everyone except Fontaine, her 2 assistants, Apolline, and Fleur. The investigators had excused themselves one by one, not dramatically, just finding reasons to be somewhere else, because the magical pressure in the room by that point was significant enough to make breathing feel slightly effortful, like being at altitude. The light in the room was extraordinary, every orb blazing, the windows seeming to pull in more sunlight than was strictly available, the air itself carrying a charge that made hair stand and skin prickle. Harry was absolutely, completely calm. Not the practiced calm of earlier, not the survival mechanism stillness of a child who'd learned not to react. Something else. Something that came from the 30 blocks being gone and his magic no longer being compressed into a fraction of its proper volume. He sat on the table with his back straight and his hands on his knees and he looked, settled. Settled in himself in the way that some people never managed in their whole lives. Fleur was in the corner. She'd been there since the halfway point and she'd stopped pretending to have a reason to be there and was just there, and no one had challenged her since about the 15th block because at some point everyone else in the room had found they had larger concerns. She was watching Harry with an expression that had moved through several stages during the afternoon, careful attention, then concentration, then something that was beginning to look like recognition, and she was very still. The 30th block came off. Harry breathed in. The windows lit up. 2 of the floating orbs went out entirely and then came back on at a brilliance that made the room feel like high noon in midsummer. Somewhere in the chateau above them, there was a muffled exclamation. Harry, Fontaine said, her voice carefully steady. Still with me? Yes, Harry said. His own voice was different again, fuller, somehow. Like a chord played properly for the first time. Yes, I'm fine. How do you feel? He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands. Something small and quiet happened. A candle on the side table, unlit, flickered to life without anyone touching it, and then 2 more did, and then the fireplace on the east wall kindled from nothing, and Harry looked at this with the calm expression of someone discovering that a door they'd always known was there had turned out not to be locked after all. Better, he said. Fontaine called the session. She was firm about it, and Harry, who had also, somewhere between block 25 and 30, apparently developed the ability to read rooms with the precision of someone who'd had the gift for years, didn't argue. He simply got off the table, rolled his shoulders once as if resettling something that had been misaligned for a long time, and looked around at the lit room with an expression Apolline would think about for days afterward. Not wonder, exactly. More like, finally. Seraphine found Apolline at dinner. Not in the dining hall, in the smaller salon that adjoined it, the one with the good chairs and the view of the courtyard, where Apolline had been going over Bertrand's documentation with a glass of wine and a headache that had been building since 10 that morning. Seraphine came in without knocking, which was her prerogative, and sat across from Apolline and looked at her with the grey, penetrating gaze that had made 30 years of council negotiations interesting for everyone involved. Tell me what happened today, Seraphine said. You have the reports. I want to hear it from you. Apolline looked at her for a moment. Then she said, he's extraordinary. I expected significant, I didn't expect what he actually is. Even with 8 blocks remaining. She set down her wine glass. We're going to need to reconsider several things. What things? Starting with the assumption that this situation is something we can manage quietly. Seraphine was quiet for a moment. Dumbledore will come, she said. When he realizes the boy is gone. I know. He won't come quietly. He has the Ministry of Magic, the Order of the Phoenix, half of Wizarding Britain, and we have jurisdiction, Apolline said. Mate-Call response is Veela sovereign right. He put 38 blocks on a child. His own blocks. With his own signature. Let him come and explain that in front of the council. Apolline. Seraphine's voice was measured. He will have an explanation. He always does. I'm sure he will, Apolline said. And I want to hear it. I want to hear every single word of it, in front of the full council, with Bertrand's documentation on the table and Harry Potter in the room. She picked up her wine glass again. I've spent 15 years investigating magical crimes, Seraphine. I know what guilt looks like when it's been wrapped in justification. I also know what it looks like when someone genuinely believes they did the right thing. Dumbledore is the second kind. That makes him more dangerous, Seraphine said. Yes, Apolline agreed. It does. Which is why we need to be ready. Seraphine studied her. And the bond? The daughter? Apolline met her gaze. That conversation happens on my timeline. Not yours. The council is not going to use a 9-year-old girl and an 8-year-old boy as political leverage, Apolline said, very quietly and very clearly. Not while I'm sitting on this council. Not while I'm standing in this building. That's not a negotiating position, Seraphine. That's a fact. The room was quiet. The courtyard beyond the window was gold in the evening light. Seraphine looked at her for a long moment. Then she stood. The last 8 blocks, she said. When? Tomorrow morning. And after? After, Apolline said, we see what we have. Harry was in the garden when the last day of block removal happened, the morning after, early, before Fontaine came to get him, standing in the lavender with his feet bare on the wet grass and his face turned up to the early light. Fleur found him there because she'd looked out her window and seen him, and came down in her dressing gown with her braid half undone and stood next to him. Can you feel it? She asked. Not what? Just, it. The one's still there. He nodded. Differently now. They used to be the whole thing, the pressure, the squeezing. Now I can feel them as separate things. Specific things. He paused. It's strange. Like, finding knots in a rope I didn't know I was carrying. Fleur looked at the chateau above them, its windows beginning to catch the first light. Last 8 today, she said. Yes. She looked sideways at him. She'd been building up to something for 2 days and she was going to say it now because she'd decided that not saying it was less useful than saying it. When they're all off, I know, Harry said. She blinked. You know what I was going to say? No, he admitted. I just know something changes when they're all off. I can feel it waiting. He looked at her. What were you going to say? Fleur was quiet for a moment, looking at the lavender, then at Harry. I was going to say that when they're all off and you know what you are, all of what you are, you should know that you don't have to do anything about it. About any of it. Not the bond, not the council, not Dumbledore, not Britain. You can just, be. First. Everything else can wait. Harry was very quiet. The morning was coming in properly now, the sky lightening from grey to gold above the hills. No one's ever said anything like that to me before, he said, very simply. I know, Fleur said, which was not a guess. They stood in the lavender until Fontaine came to find them. The last 8 blocks took 4 hours. The first of them, Block 31, was the most complex piece of magical architecture Bertrand had ever personally witnessed, and he'd been investigating magical crimes for 22 years. The next 6 came in descending order of complexity, each one old, each one deep, each one requiring Fontaine's full focus. By the time they reached the 38th, the medical wing had been sealed from the outside by a combination of Apolline's authority and Celine's wards, because the ambient magic in the room was doing things that were not dangerous but were deeply inadvisable to have onlookers for. The 38th block was the oldest. It was 15 months old in one sense, it was the first, the one placed on a baby in the wreckage of his parents' legacy. But it was also, Bertrand had determined from its structure, more than that. It wasn't just a suppression matrix. It had a secondary function, containment. Not of Harry's magic in general, but of something specific. Something deep in his core that Dumbledore, at some point in 1981, had apparently decided was too dangerous to ever be accessible. What is it? Harry asked, when Fontaine showed him the diagram. We don't know yet, Fontaine said carefully. We'll know when it comes off. Harry looked at the diagram for a moment. Then he lay back on the table, folded his hands on his stomach, and said, "Do it." Fontaine worked for 11 minutes on the 38th block. Then it came off. The room went white. Not literally, no one in it was blinded, no one was hurt. It was more that the magical light in the space went from present and significant to overwhelming in the space of about half a second, and every orb in the room blazed like a small sun, and the windows went brilliant, and the very stones of the chateau seemed to vibrate at a frequency that was below sound but above nothing. And Harry sat up. He sat up and he looked at his hands, and this time the candles didn't just kindle, every candle in the room, every sconce, every orb adjusted to his presence the way flowers track sunlight, and the fireplace, already lit, roared up 4 feet and then settled back down, and the windows that had been open cracked and strained against their frames in a wind that came from nowhere and was gone just as fast. He looked at Apolline. She looked back. There it is, he said quietly. And there it was. No blocks. No cages. No compressed, glass-muffled something that he could see but not touch. Just Harry Potter, 8 years old, thin, with sellotape on his glasses and bare feet and a scar on his forehead and green eyes that were currently doing something extraordinary, which was being absolutely, completely, peacefully certain of themselves. Fleur was against the far wall, she'd been pressed there not by any force but by pure instinct, the Veela in her responding to the magnitude of what was in the room, and she was watching him with wide eyes and something on her face that Harry would remember later, when he was older and had more words for it. Recognition, he thought. That was the word. She looked like someone seeing something they'd known was real finally proven to be real. Right, Harry said, and sat up straighter, and looked around at the room full of stunned Veela investigators and one extremely still healer. So. What happens now? What happened now was Seraphine, in the corridor outside, who had been waiting for an hour. She came in when the wards dropped, walked through the room with her straight-backed 70-year-old authority, and stopped in front of Harry. She looked at him the way she'd looked at him in the corridor 2 days ago, that same assessing gaze, the one that had made him look back without shrinking. He looked back now, and the quality of it was different. Not threatening. Not adversarial. But absolutely, serenely uncompromised. The look of someone who knows what they are and is not in the habit of apologizing for it. Seraphine looked at him for a long time. The room was very quiet. Then she said, in English, "The council convenes tomorrow. You should be there." Harry held her gaze. "I will be," he said. Seraphine nodded, once, in the manner of someone who has received the answer they needed, and left. Apolline watched the door close behind her and then looked at Harry, who was regarding it thoughtfully. "She's planning something," Harry said. "Yes," Apolline agreed. "Are you?" She looked at him. "Yes," she said, because he deserved honesty, and because any other answer would have been a waste of both their times. Harry nodded slowly. "Can I help?" he said. Apolline blinked. Then, for the first time since she'd knocked on the door of number 4, Privet Drive 2 mornings ago, she smiled, a real one, not the professional one. "Yes," she said. "I rather think you can." Chapter 3, The Nation Decides. The Veela Council's great chamber was built into the bedrock beneath Chateau Lumineuse, and the only way to reach it was through a corridor that descended at a gentle angle for approximately 3 minutes before opening, without any dramatic transition, no grand doors, no announcement, directly into a space that felt like being inside a geological formation that had decided to become political. The chamber was circular, carved from pale limestone that had been absorbing magical light for 4 centuries and now generated its own soft luminescence, independent of any external source. Tiered seating rose on all sides in a half-circle, carved from the same stone. At the center was a floor of polished quartz, and at the far edge of that floor was the matriarch's chair, not a throne, strictly speaking, but something that had developed throne-like qualities over the centuries by virtue of who sat in it and what they decided. 43 council members occupied the chamber at full convening. They came from every major Veela community across Europe, French, Bulgarian, Greek, Croatian, Polish, and they ranged in age from 20-something up to Seraphine herself, and they were all, to varying degrees, extraordinary to look at, because that was simply what Veela were. Harry had been told this by Apolline on the walk down, matter-of-factly, as preparation. "They'll try to read you," she'd said. "Not deliberately, not most of them, it's instinct. Veela assess. Just, be yourself." "What does that mean?" Harry had asked. Apolline had looked at him sideways. "It means don't try to be impressive and don't try to be small. Both of those are choices. Just be where you are." Harry had thought about this and nodded and filed it. He sat now in the observer's gallery, a stone bench set into the wall to the left of the main seating, where non-members could attend council proceedings. Apolline had put him here before the session opened and gone to take her own seat in the inner tier, and Fleur was beside him, which was probably not technically sanctioned but which no one had yet tried to challenge, possibly because the council was occupied with the fact of Harry's presence in general and hadn't gotten to the specifics of where exactly he was sitting. "Who are the important ones?" Harry murmured, watching the chamber fill. Fleur had grown up coming to council sessions on the occasions her mother brought her along, and she had the observer's eye of someone who'd spent childhood in the background of important rooms. "The woman in the blue on the left tier, that's Councillor Vasiliev. Bulgarian. She and my mother don't agree on much but they agree on the things that matter. She'll be useful." She paused. The 2 men in the center, talking to each other, Deschamps and Fournier. They vote with whoever they think is winning until they're sure, and then they vote with whoever they think is right. So watch which way they're leaning. "And the one behind Seraphine?" Harry had already picked him out, a man of about 50, white blonde hair, who had come in and positioned himself 3 steps behind the matriarch with the practiced invisibility of someone whose function was to be influential while appearing to be merely present. "He's not a council member." Fleur's eyes tracked to him. "No," she said, with a slight change in her voice. "That's Marcus Aldrich. He's the council's, I suppose the word is strategist. He advises the matriarch. He's been doing it for 20 years. Does your mother trust him?" "She thinks he's very good at his job," Fleur said, which was not an answer to the question Harry had asked, and Harry noticed. "She doesn't trust him," he said. "No," Fleur agreed. "She doesn't." Seraphine called the session to order without ceremony. She simply sat in the matriarch's chair and the room quieted, the way rooms quieted for people who had been making them quiet for decades. She looked out at the assembled council with the grey gaze that Harry was becoming familiar with, then let it rest briefly on the observer's gallery. "Before we begin," she said, "I will address the presence of our guest directly." Her voice carried in the chamber without apparent effort. "Harry Potter is here as an observer only, by my authorization. He is not a petitioner. He is not a witness. He is not subject to council judgment." A pause. "He is a child who was brought to our attention by circumstances this council is about to discuss, and his presence here today is informational." Several council members looked at Harry. Harry looked back, without making a production of it. "Informational," Fleur repeated quietly, with a skepticism she didn't bother to conceal. "She's managing the narrative," Harry said, equally quietly. "If she defines what I am before anyone else does, she controls what they see." He wasn't particularly bothered by this. It was just a thing that was happening, and it was useful to know. Fleur looked at him. "You've been in high-stakes rooms before," she said, with some surprise. I've been in a classroom with 30 children who all know something happened to you and are watching to see what you do about it, Harry said. Different scale. Same mechanics. The session began. Apolline presented the investigative report first, which was proper procedure and also, Harry suspected, deliberate positioning. If she went early, the information was framed by her before anyone else could frame it. She stood at the center floor with Bertrand's documentation laid out on a table beside her, and she was precise, methodical, and absolutely without sentimentality. She presented the facts, the Mate-Call, the origin point, the team's response, the discovery of number 4 Privet Drive and its occupants, the initial block detection, the full audit of 38 suppression matrices, the complete uniform attribution of all 38 to Albus Dumbledore's magical signature, the physical assessment, the removal process, and the current status. She presented the documentation in full. She named each block by type and described its function. She spoke for 40 minutes without notes. When she was done, the chamber was very quiet. The kind of quiet that wasn't absence of sound but was people holding on to something internally. Counselor Vasiliev spoke first. She had a low voice and an accent that transformed English into something more angular and precise. This is the magical signature documentation. She held up one of Bertrand's sheets. Yes, Apolline said. Independently verified by both Celine Marchetti and the Chateau's own archive system, which has had Albus Dumbledore's magical signature on record since his 1942 visit to the council in connection with the Grindelwald situation. All 38, Vasiliev said. Not a question. All 38. The chamber talked at once, briefly, before Seraphine raised a hand and it went quiet again. The question before this council, Seraphine said, is how to proceed. There are several matters to be decided. She looked around the room. First, the question of the child's status within our jurisdiction. Second, the question of our response to the magical crimes evidenced in this documentation. Third, the question of the mate bond. She paused precisely. We will address them in that order. The child's status is simple, said Deschamps, one of the central pair Harry had been watching, dark-haired, mid-40s, with the smooth delivery of someone who talked for a living. He's a magical minor from the British jurisdiction who has been brought onto Veela's sovereign territory under emergency Mate-Call protocols. He remains here under those protocols until the council determines his formal status, Aldrich said from behind Seraphine. He said it softly, almost gently, as if he were completing Deschamps' sentence rather than rewriting it, but Harry heard the distinction immediately. Until we determine his status was very different from until the emergency protocols expire. One implied Harry was a guest whose stay was time-limited. The other implied the council got to decide what happened to him. Apolline heard it too. Emergency Mate-Call protocols are not temporary guest provisions, she said. They're jurisdictional sovereignty markers. As long as there is an active bond response between Harry Potter and a member of the Veela nation, this council has jurisdictional interest in his welfare. That's not a temporary status. No, Aldrich agreed pleasantly. It's a permanent one. Which is precisely why it needs to be formally defined. It is defined by the protocols. The protocols define jurisdiction, Aldrich said. They don't define guardianship. And this child currently has no magical guardian. His original guardian was removed from the equation this morning when legal notification was sent to the British Ministry that the Dursley family had been found in violation of Marcus. Seraphine's voice was not loud. But it was final. Later. Aldrich stepped back with a small nod. Harry was watching Aldrich with the particular quality of attention he reserved for things that seemed routine and weren't. The man was very good. He'd done exactly what he intended to do, planted the word guardianship in the room, made the council hear it, and then stepped back before anyone could argue with it directly. It would sit in the chamber now like furniture. People would think around it. He wants to make me a ward of the council, Harry said quietly. Fleur's jaw tightened. Yes. Does that give the council control over me? Decisions about where I go, what I do. Yes, Fleur said. It would. Harry looked at Aldrich, who was standing behind Seraphine with his hands folded and his face professionally pleasant. Your mother's going to argue against it. She's the only one who will if Seraphine wants it, Fleur said. Which Seraphine does. A ward of the council who happens to be, she stopped. Who happens to be what? Fleur looked at him. Who happens to be Harry Potter, she said carefully, is a considerable political asset. To the Veela nation, in its relationship with the British magical government. Harry nodded slowly. This also was just information. It told him what the room wanted to make him and what Apolline was trying to prevent, and it was useful to know both. Okay, he said. The second matter, the question of response to Dumbledore, generated the most heat of the morning session. Several council members wanted formal charges filed through the International Confederation of Wizards. Several more wanted to wait until they'd heard from Dumbledore directly. A small but vocal cluster, led by a Polish counselor named Wisniewska who had clearly come with a position prepared and was delivering it with the compressed energy of someone who'd been waiting for an opening, wanted immediate and public censure, full publication of the documentation, and notification to the British Ministry. Notification to the British Ministry, Apolline said, during a brief pause in Wisniewska's delivery, is complicated by the fact that the British Ministry has a complicated relationship with Albus Dumbledore. He was their chief warlock until last year. He has significant influence over their operations. If we notify them first, we give him the ability to control the narrative on that end before, so we don't notify them first, Vasiliev said. We notify them simultaneously with the public documentation. Or, said Fournier, the other of the central pair, quieter than Deschamps, with an economist's habit of reducing everything to function, we don't do anything until he comes to us. Which he will. And we hear what he says, and we document that too. He has to come to us, someone asked. He will, Apolline said. He'll know the boy is gone by now. He'll trace it. He'll come. She glanced toward the observers' gallery briefly, not a long look, just a check. And when he does, we want to be ready. Ready for what, precisely? Aldrich said pleasantly. An 80-year-old headmaster coming to express concern for a child he'd placed with a family? I'm sure his explanation will be, his explanation, Harry said. The chamber went very still. He'd said it at normal volume, not loudly, not with any particular projection, from the observers' gallery. But the chamber's acoustics, designed for a full council session, carried it with perfect clarity to every corner, and 38 people who had been talking about him turned to look at him with the combined force of a lot of extremely perceptive individuals suddenly paying direct attention. Harry didn't stand. He was sitting on the stone bench with his feet not quite reaching the floor and his arms resting on his knees, and he was looking at Aldrich with the same flat, assessing steadiness he'd been using since Apolline knocked on his door. I wasn't supposed to speak, he said. Your matriarch said I was an observer. He paused. But Counselor Aldrich just implied that Dumbledore putting 38 blocks on me when I was 15 months old might have a reasonable explanation. And since I'm the one who had them, I thought I should be in the room when that explanation comes. He let that sit there for exactly as long as it needed to. Which I will be. Not a question. Not a request. Just a fact, stated at 8 years old with the calm certainty of someone who has decided that the room needs to know this particular piece of information. Seraphine was looking at him. That same long, assessing look. Calculating something. You were told you were an observer, she said. Yes, Harry agreed. I'm observing. He kept her gaze steadily. I'm observing that my status, my guardianship, and what happens when Dumbledore arrives are all being decided right now, in this room, without me. I understand that's how councils work. I'm not arguing with your process. He paused. I just wanted you to know I'm paying attention. The chamber was very quiet. Vasiliev, Harry noticed from the corner of his attention, had covered her mouth with one hand and appeared to be suppressing something. Harry, Apolline said, carefully. I'm done, Harry said, and looked back at the chamber floor with the air of someone who has said what he came to say and is comfortable with having said it. Seraphine held his gaze for another moment. Then she looked back at the council. "We will recess for 1 hour," she said. The recess happened in a dozen small groups scattered through the corridor outside the chamber and in 2 side rooms that Apolline knew about and Harry was beginning to figure out. He stayed where he was while the council streamed out, because Apolline had put him in the observer's gallery and he had no reason to move, and because staying put while everyone else moved around him was often more informative than moving yourself. Fleur stayed too. Of course she did. That was not small, she said, when the chamber had emptied enough for her to say it at a normal volume. "I know," Harry said. "You just told the Grand Matriarch of the Veela Council that you were going to be present when Dumbledore arrives." Without asking. Without, she needed to know, Harry said simply. If she'd decided I wasn't going to be there, she would have arranged it before he arrived. Now she has to think about what that looks like, the child who was harmed not being present when the person who harmed him gives his explanation. He looked at Fleur. "She'll let me be there. Not because she wants to. Because not letting me there is more complicated." Fleur stared at him. "How do you, people make decisions based on what's easiest?" Harry said. "Usually. The easiest thing for Seraphine is to let me be in the room and manage what I do while I'm there. Easier than the alternative, which is blocking my attendance and having that be the story instead of whatever Dumbledore says." Fleur was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in French, something that Harry didn't understand yet but that had the cadence of a mild oath. "What does that mean?" he asked. "It means," Fleur said, "that you are going to be very difficult for everyone to manage." "Good," Harry said. He said it without smugness, without performance. Just as information. He'd been manageable for 8 years and what that had bought him was 38 blocks and a cupboard under the stairs. Apolline found them 15 minutes into the recess. She came through the side door and crossed the empty chamber with the decisive stride she used when she was operating in problem-solving mode rather than political mode, and sat down on the bench beside Harry with the energy of someone setting down a heavy object. "Right," she said. "That was interesting. Is Vasiliev on your side?" Harry asked. Apolline looked at him sideways. "Yes. On the guardianship question, fully. On the Dumbledore response, mostly." She paused. "How did you get that from 30 seconds of observation?" "She covered her mouth when I spoke," Harry said. "People do that when they're amused by something they're not supposed to be amused by. Which means she liked what I said. Which means she's sympathetic to, whatever I am in this room." Apolline looked at him steadily for a long moment. "Harry, when I said be yourself earlier, I know," he said. "Was it too much?" "No," she said, and meant it. "No, it wasn't too much. It was," she searched for the word. "It was precisely correct. Seraphine is going to allow you to be present when Dumbledore comes, partly because of what you just said and partly because I was going to insist on it anyway. But the fact that you put it in the room yourself means she knows she's dealing with someone who knows what he's doing." She paused. "She respects that, even when it inconveniences her. Does she still want to make me a ward of the council?" Harry asked. "Yes. Are you going to stop her?" Apolline looked at him. "I'm going to make it very, very difficult," she said. "Harry, the council's jurisdiction over you is real, the Mate-Call protocols are legitimate and give us standing here that the British ministry can't easily challenge. But wardship is different. That's structural. That's the council having formal decision-making authority over your life until you're of age." She was very direct about it, because he'd shown he wanted directness. "I don't think that's appropriate. I don't think it's what you need. But I also don't control this council, Seraphine does. And she's very good at what she does." "What do you control?" Harry asked. Apolline was quiet for a moment. "Apolline Delacour," she said. "My branch. My investigators. My voice in that room. She glanced at him. And what I do with my own family, which the council cannot dictate to me regardless of what else they decide. Harry absorbed this. Outside the chamber, the voices in the corridor were starting to move back toward the door. The recess was ending. The guardianship question, he said carefully. If no one else has standing, if it comes down to the council or nothing, Harry, I'd rather it be you, he said. Not the council. You. He said it without drama, without hesitation. He'd made the calculation quickly and he trusted it. If I have to have a guardian, I want it to be someone who went to Privet Drive because a child was in trouble, not because a political situation needed managing. Apolline was very still for a moment. That's my preference, Harry added. I understand it might not be how it works. It might be exactly how it works, Apolline said, and her voice had done something, changed register slightly, become something warmer and less professional than the tone she usually maintained. French magical law allows for an individual to assume guardianship of a magical minor under emergency jurisdiction if they have both the standing and the professional connection to the case. I investigated. I led the extraction. I could, she stopped. I would need to want to, which I do. I would need to file it before the wardship motion passes, which I can do during this recess. I would need to be prepared for Seraphine to be very unhappy about it. Are you afraid of Seraphine? Harry asked. Apolline gave him a look that was dry and complicated and also somehow fond. I have been working for Seraphine Voss for 15 years, she said. She is 73 years old and she has the political memory of a glacier. No, I am not afraid of her. She can be very unhappy with me. I have extensive experience with that. Harry nodded once. Okay, he said. You know you keep saying okay when things are actually very significant, Apolline said. It is okay, Harry said, simply. You'll do the filing and Seraphine will be unhappy and that's a problem for later. Right now the council is coming back and we need to know how the vote on the Dumbledore response is going to go. Apolline looked at him for one more moment. Then she stood, straightened her jacket, and said, Vasiliev has 3 votes she can pull. I have 4, possibly 5. Deschamps is leaning toward the public documentation approach, which I can work with, and Fournier will follow Deschamps once Deschamps is committed. She paused. The wardship vote I'm going to make irrelevant. The Dumbledore vote will go your way, Harry said. She raised an eyebrow. You documented everything, he said. You have his signature on 38 blocks placed on a baby. Anyone in that room who votes against a response to that has to explain why, in writing, as part of the council record. Nobody wants their name on that record. He looked at the chamber floor. You already won that vote. You just have to let them vote. Apolline was quiet for a moment. Then she walked toward the side door to file her guardianship motion, and paused with her hand on the frame. Harry. He looked up. I'm going to file as guardian, she said. But I want you to understand, that's not the council managing you. That's me and my family saying you're not alone in this. However long it takes, whatever comes next. She looked at him steadily. That's different. Harry held her gaze. I know, he said. That's why I asked. She left. Harry turned back to face the chamber as the council members filed back in, and Fleur sat beside him and they watched Seraphine take the matriarch's chair again and call order, and Fleur said quietly, she's going to file guardianship, isn't she? Yes, Harry said. Fleur absorbed this. Then she said, also quietly, good. And then, after a beat, that was a very graceful way to ask. It was honest, Harry said, which he seemed to consider the same thing. The afternoon session was longer. The Dumbledore response vote went largely as Harry had predicted, Apolline's framing, Vasiliev's block, Deschamps committing mid-debate and pulling Fournier with him, and the final motion passing 29-14 in favor of formal notification to Dumbledore, full documentation sent to the International Confederation of Wizards, and a public statement from the Council about the case without naming Harry specifically. The wardship motion came up near the end. Aldrich presented it for Seraphine, which was itself information, because it meant Seraphine wanted deniability from whatever debate it generated, and it was a careful document, well constructed, citing the protocols and precedents and the specific conditions that made Council wardship technically applicable. Apolline stood when it was presented. "I have filed emergency guardianship through the French Magical Families Registry," she said. "The filing timestamp predates this motion by 43 minutes. The child has a guardian. This motion is procedurally moot." The chamber was quiet. Aldrich said, pleasantly, "That filing can be challenged on the grounds that, it can be challenged," Apolline said, with equal pleasantness, "through the Family Registry Tribunal, which has a standing review period of 90 days minimum, during which the guardianship stands. So yes. Challenge it, if the Council decides that's the best use of its resources." She looked around the room. "Or we can move on." Seraphine was looking at Apolline with an expression that was not anger exactly, it was too composed for anger, but which had the quality of someone reassessing the board after an unexpected move. She let the silence run for 4 seconds. Then she said, "We'll move on." Aldrich stepped back. His pleasant expression hadn't changed, which meant he was going to be doing something about this later, but for now it was done. Fleur released a breath she'd been holding. "She did it," she said. "Yes," Harry said. He was watching Seraphine, not Apolline. Because Apolline had won the immediate moment, but Seraphine was already thinking about the next one. That was what made her formidable, not that she couldn't be outmaneuvered, but that being outmaneuvered was just information to her. She collected it and continued. "You're watching her," Fleur said. "She's not done," Harry said. "No," Fleur agreed. "She never is." The session wound down through several procedural matters, communications protocols, documentation handling, liaison appointments, that Harry paid partial attention to while thinking about what came next. Dumbledore had been notified. The Council had formal documentation. Apolline had filed guardianship. What came next was Dumbledore arriving. Harry had been thinking about this since Apolline first said his name, back at the farmhouse in Calais. He'd turned it over and examined it from every angle he could find, the way he examined most things, and what he'd arrived at was this: Dumbledore was not stupid. He was not malicious in a simple way. He'd had reasons. Harry didn't know what they were yet, and he needed to know, not because he was going to let the reasons make the 38 blocks acceptable, nothing was going to make 38 blocks on a 15-month-old acceptable, but because you couldn't properly deal with someone until you understood what they actually believed. He also knew this: whatever Dumbledore expected to find when he arrived at Chateau Lumineuse, it was not going to be what was actually there. Seraphine caught them in the corridor as the Council session dissolved. Not accidentally, she positioned herself with the precision of someone who had been running timed interceptions for decades, so that when Harry and Fleur came out of the chamber she was standing in the corridor at exactly the point where the natural flow of foot traffic required you to pass within speaking distance. Harry slowed without stopping. "You handled yourself well in there," Seraphine said to him. Her voice was neutral. Not warm, not cold. "Thank you," Harry said. "You said you wanted to be present when Dumbledore comes." "Yes." Seraphine looked at him for a long moment. In the corridor light she looked older than she did in the chamber, not diminished, but more human, the weight of the years more visible. "He's been notified. He'll arrive within 24 hours, most likely." She paused. "I will allow you to be present. But I want something from you in return." Harry waited. "I want you to let the Council manage the encounter," she said. "You'll have your chance to speak. But you follow our lead until that moment. You don't speak before I indicate you can. You don't react to anything he says before I do." She held his gaze. "Can you do that?" Harry thought about this honestly. "Yes," he said. "Good." She began to turn. Can I ask why? Harry said. She paused. Turned back. Why do you want me to let the council lead? He said. Not the procedural reason, I understand the procedural reason. The real one. Seraphine looked at him with something that was not quite surprise but was the nearest thing he'd seen on her face. Then she said, because Albus Dumbledore is a man who deals in narratives. He will arrive with a story and that story will be very good. The council has documentation that cuts through stories. If you react, if you give him the emotional response of a child who has been wronged, which you are and you have, he will redirect the conversation to your emotional state and away from his actions. She paused. He's done it before. To people who were much older than you and should have known better. Harry held her gaze. You know him, he said. I have known of him for a long time, Seraphine said carefully. And his methods. She looked at Harry with something that was not warmth but was its own complicated thing, the look of someone calculating a person's capacity and arriving at a number higher than expected. He will be surprised to find you here. Even more surprised to find you, as you are. A pause. Use that. I intend to, Harry said. Something moved across Seraphine's face. Not a smile, more like the acknowledgement that a smile would have been appropriate. Then she walked away down the corridor, and Fleur came to stand beside Harry and watched her go. She just tried to recruit you, Fleur said. Yes, Harry said. And you, I thanked her for the advice, Harry said, which was genuine. And I didn't agree to work for her, which she noticed. He watched Seraphine's straight-backed figure disappear around the corner. She's not bad, you know. She thinks about the nation first and the people second. Which is probably the right way to think if you're running the nation. Just not the right way to think about me. Fleur was quiet for a moment. Then, is the advice good? About Dumbledore? Harry thought about it. Yes, he said honestly. He probably is very good at redirecting conversations. Most adults are, with children. They use your age against you, make the fact that you're young into an argument that you can't possibly understand complex things. He paused. But he's going to have a harder time doing that than he's used to. Because you're not going to react emotionally, Fleur said. Oh, I'll react emotionally, Harry said. That's not the same as reacting uselessly. He turned away from the corner where Seraphine had disappeared and started walking toward the stairs. I'm allowed to be angry. I just don't have to let the anger be the only thing I am. Fleur fell into step beside him. They walked in silence for a moment through the stone corridor, the chateau alive and full above them, the lavender evening outside the narrow windows. He'll arrive tomorrow, Fleur said. Yes. How do you feel about that? Harry thought about this honestly, the way he thought about most things, directly, without looking away from it. Strange, he said. He's the reason I spent 8 years not being this. He looked at his hands as they walked, the hands that had kindled candles from across the room without trying, that were connected now to something enormous and finally uncaged. But he's also, I don't know him. I don't know what he thinks he was doing. I need to know that before I know how to feel about it. Most people don't wait to know before they feel, Fleur said. I know, Harry said. That's probably why Seraphine told me not to react. Fleur stopped walking. Harry stopped a step later and turned back. What? He said. Fleur was looking at him with the expression she had sometimes, the one that he was learning meant she was being very honest about something without having decided yet whether to say it. She'd had it in the garden that morning, before the last blocks came off. She had it now. Nothing, she said, and started walking again. Harry turned this over. Fleur. It's nothing. You're the least nothing person I've ever met, he said. She glanced at him sideways, caught off guard by that, and something in her expression shifted, the prepared quality of it dropping away for a moment. She looked, briefly, exactly like what she was, which was a 9-year-old girl in a very complicated situation that she hadn't chosen and was doing her best with. "I was just thinking," she said, more carefully, "that you've been here 3 days. Yes. And you've met the Grand Matriarch and survived a council session and convinced my mother to file for your guardianship, and you're preparing to face Albus Dumbledore tomorrow." She paused. "And 3 days ago you were in a cupboard under a staircase." Harry was quiet for a moment. "A room," he said. "By then it was a room." "Harry." "I know," he said. He looked at her. "But I've also been doing all those things while carrying 38 blocks. Now I'm not." He said it the same way he'd said most important things, without drama, just as the fact of it. "Whatever comes tomorrow, I'm doing it as what I actually am. For the first time." He looked at the corridor ahead of them. "That seems like enough." Fleur looked at him. Then she nodded once, not as agreement exactly, but as the acknowledgement of something seen. They walked up the stairs and into the golden light of the chateau's evening, and tomorrow sat ahead of them like weather, large and real and coming regardless, and neither of them pretending otherwise. Chapter 4, The Headmaster's Answer. Dumbledore arrived at 11:10 in the morning. He didn't come to the main gates, which was the first interesting thing, because the main gates were where visitors came, and Dumbledore apparently did not think of himself as a visitor. He apparatted directly to the edge of the chateau's outer wards, which was as close as external apparition could get, and then he walked up the eastern path through the lavender fields toward the entrance with the unhurried ease of someone who had decided the ground beneath his feet was friendly before it had confirmed this. Harry watched him from the window of the first-floor library, where he'd been for the past 2 hours with 4 books open on the table and his attention on none of them. He'd woken at 5 and read until 7 and then gone to find Apolline and found Fleur instead, and they'd had breakfast together in the small dining room off the kitchen while the chateau prepared itself around them with the particular charged quality of a place that knew something significant was coming. Dumbledore was tall, not imposingly so, but present in the way of very tall people who have learned to hold themselves so their height becomes gravity rather than bulk. He was wearing Muggle clothes, which Harry thought was itself a calculated choice, a long grey overcoat over what appeared to be ordinary trousers, sensible shoes, his half-moon spectacles. He'd left the robes and the pointed hat at home. He was coming as a reasonable man on a reasonable errand, and he'd dressed for the part. He had a long silver beard and a face that was old in the way that certain faces became old, not diminished by it, but layered, accumulated, the years readable in it like sediment. And he was looking up at the chateau as he walked with an expression that Harry could not read from this distance but was trying to anyway, because reading people from available information was how Harry had navigated most of his life and he wasn't going to stop now. "He's taller than I expected," Fleur said from the chair behind him. Harry watched Dumbledore reach the bottom of the main steps. He moved carefully, not stiffly, but with the deliberateness of someone who had decided some time ago that rushing anywhere was undignified and possibly counterproductive. "He's not worried." "No." "Look at his hands," Harry said. Fleur moved to the window beside him. Dumbledore's hands were loose at his sides, unhurried. Someone who was worried would have their hands doing something. Gripping something. He's not. He thinks this is manageable. "It probably usually is," Fleur said. "For him." "Yes," Harry said. "That's the problem." Below, one of the council's reception staff had appeared at the top of the steps, not Seraphine, who would not come to the door for anyone, but a woman named Apolline who handled formal arrivals and who had apparently been briefed, because her bearing as she spoke to Dumbledore had the particular quality of someone being professionally polite while giving nothing away. Dumbledore said something and smiled. The smile was visible even from the first-floor window, warm, self-deprecating, the smile of a grandfather arriving at a family occasion. Apolline did not visibly warm to it, which suggested she'd been very thoroughly briefed, and led him inside. Harry moved away from the window. "Ready?" Fleur said. "Yes," Harry said. He picked up his jacket from the back of his chair. One of the things Apolline had quietly arranged in the past 2 days was a proper wardrobe, because Harry had arrived with nothing and she'd simply fixed that without making it a moment, and put it on. "Where's your mother?" "Council chamber. She's been there since 9. Fleur paused. "She wanted you to eat something before it started." "I did eat something. She said 2 bites of bread doesn't count." Harry looked at her. "How does she know how many bites I had?" Fleur raised an eyebrow in a way that suggested this was a somewhat naive question about her mother's capabilities, and Harry filed it and moved on. The chamber had a different quality today than it had during yesterday's council session. The lighting was the same, the luminescent stone, the floating orbs, but the seating arrangement had changed. The full tiered circle was occupied, but the center floor now had 2 chairs facing each other across the polished quartz, and a third chair set slightly to the side. The documentation Bertrand had compiled was on a table visible to both the chairs and the gallery. There was no table between the 2 facing chairs, no barrier, no formal surface. Just open space. Apolline had arranged this, Harry understood immediately. 2 chairs face to face meant a conversation, not an interrogation, which meant Dumbledore couldn't position himself as someone being questioned. But it also meant he had nowhere to put anything, no surface to lean on, no physical position from which to project authority. He would have to sit in a chair and be visible. The third chair was to the right of Apolline's. Harry sat in it without being told, because it was obviously where he was supposed to sit, and Apolline glanced at him when he did and gave him the small nod of someone who has confirmed a thing they already expected. The council filled the gallery in silence. Seraphine was in the matriarch's chair, which today was positioned at the edge of the central floor rather than at its far point, closer to the action, which meant she intended to be part of the conversation rather than above it. Aldrich stood behind her left shoulder. Fleur was in the observer's gallery where she'd sat yesterday. They waited. Dumbledore came in through the main chamber door 3 minutes later. He came alone, he'd apparently not brought anyone, which was either confidence or strategy or both, and he walked down the center aisle toward the floor with exactly the same unhurried deliberateness he'd shown crossing the lavender fields. He looked around the chamber with the expression of someone finding it genuinely impressive, which might have been real. He saw Harry when he reached the central floor. Harry watched him see it happen. Watched the moment of, not quite recognition, because Dumbledore had presumably known Harry would be here, but something more complicated. The slight recalibration behind the eyes. The adjustment of his understanding of what was in the room. Because Harry was not the child Dumbledore had left at Privet Drive. Whatever Dumbledore had been expecting, a small frightened boy, a child visibly diminished by 8 years of blocks and Dursleys, something he could be kind and managing toward, he was looking at something else entirely. Harry was sitting in the chair next to Apolline Delacour with his feet flat on the floor and his hands on the armrests and a quality of presence that had not been there 3 days ago, and Dumbledore was clearly aware of this difference even without knowing what had caused it. Which he would know, Harry thought. He would know exactly what had caused it. Dumbledore sat in the empty chair. He arranged himself comfortably, not performance, just a man sitting down. He placed his hands on his knees and looked across at Apolline and said, in a voice that was warm and measured and carried the kind of natural authority that didn't require volume, "Madame Delacour. Thank you for seeing me." "Of course," Apolline said, with equal pleasantness. "Thank you for coming so promptly." "When a child in my care goes missing," Dumbledore said, "I try to be prompt." "In your care," Apolline said. A pause. Just a pause. Not argumentative, not loaded with any audible inflection. Just the words, sitting there. "I see." Dumbledore's gaze moved to Harry. "Harry," he said. His voice shifted, not dramatically, but perceptibly. Warmer. Softer. The voice one used with children who needed to be reassured. "I'm glad to see you're all right." "I'm fine," Harry said. Flat, informational. Not rude. Just the answer to the statement, nothing added. Dumbledore held his gaze for a moment. The half-moon glasses caught the chamber light and obscured his eyes slightly, which Harry found interesting as a design choice. Then he looked back at Apolline. "I understand there are concerns," he said. "About the magical protections I placed on Harry when he was very young. I would very much like the opportunity to explain them." "We're interested in hearing your explanation," Apolline said. "But first, for the record, so that the Council is clear, can you confirm that all 38 suppression matrices documented in our assessment carry your magical signature?" Dumbledore was quiet for exactly 1 beat. 1. "Yes," he said. "They do." The chamber was very still. "Thank you," Apolline said. "Please, explain." Dumbledore's explanation was good. Harry had expected it to be, and it was. He spoke for 22 minutes without notes, without hesitation, with the coherence and sincerity of someone who had rehearsed not by memorizing but by believing. He was that kind of dangerous, not the kind who lied, but the kind who had built a complete and internally consistent version of reality in which everything they'd done made sense. He talked about Voldemort. He talked about the prophecy, the fact of it, not its contents, carefully skirting the specifics while making clear their weight. He talked about the period after the Potters' deaths, the chaos and fear, the wizarding world rebuilding itself on the wreckage of a war, children and adults alike traumatized. He talked about what Harry was, what Harry's magic had presented as, even at 15 months old, in the aftermath of surviving the killing curse, and he talked about it with the manner of someone presenting an impossible responsibility they'd shouldered without complaining. "The power Harry carries," Dumbledore said, his voice still warm, still measured, "was not something I blocked lightly or without profound consideration. What I witnessed in that house, in the immediate aftermath of Voldemort's attack, Harry was 15 months old and his magical core was in a state of active, uncontrolled expansion that would have been detectable by any dark practitioner within a radius of, so you blocked it to protect him," Apolline said. "To protect him," Dumbledore said. "And to protect those around him. A magical core of that magnitude, uncontrolled, in a child without any framework for managing it, 1 block," Apolline said pleasantly. "To contain the active expansion. Perhaps 2 or 3, for redundancy." She tilted her head. "Walk me through 38. Dumbledore paused. Adjusted. It was smooth, genuinely smooth, the adjustment of a skilled conversationalist who had hit a wall and moved around it without showing the impact. "The initial blocks were containment," he said. "As Harry grew and his magic developed, additional suppression became necessary to maintain what?" Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him. The warmth in his expression was still there, but something behind it was doing something more complicated. "I'm sorry." "Maintain what?" Harry said again, the same flat informational register. "You said additional suppression became necessary to maintain what? What were you maintaining?" "The containment," Dumbledore said, gently. "Harry, what I'm trying to explain is that your power, without structure, without guidance, has been getting along fine for the past 3 days," Harry said. "Since Healer Fontaine took the last block off yesterday morning. Nothing has exploded. Nothing uncontrolled has happened." He looked at Dumbledore steadily. "So I'm wondering what, specifically, you thought needed containing for 8 years. Dumbledore was quiet. It was a different quality of quiet than his earlier pauses, not strategic, not a conversational move. Something more real. "You're 8 years old," he said, and his voice had changed slightly. "Not patronizing, or not only patronizing. Something more complex underneath it. What you're feeling right now, the sense of capability, of freedom, that's real. But Harry, the framework isn't there yet. The judgment. The understanding of what that power means and how it can be used," Harry said. "That's the word you're looking for. Used." He kept his voice level. He was not performing calm, he was calm, underneath, in the deep place where the blocks used to live, and the calm was real. The anger was also real. They were both there and he was the one deciding which was in the room right now. You blocked 38 aspects of my magical core because you were worried about how I would use my power. I was worried about many things, Dumbledore said. Name them, Harry said. The chamber was very still. Dumbledore looked at Harry and Harry looked at Dumbledore, and the distance between the two chairs felt, in that moment, like more than the physical distance it was. Control, Dumbledore said, finally. Quietly. Honestly, Harry thought, or at least more honestly than the earlier version. A child with that level of power, growing up outside the magical world, without training, without mentorship, the potential for catastrophic accidental magic alone, so train me, Harry said. Mentor me. You knew what I was. You knew what I could do. Those were options. He paused. 38 blocks weren't a protection decision. They were a control decision. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. You sound very certain of that for someone who's had 3 days to process this. I've had 8 years, Harry said. I just didn't have the vocabulary for it. He held Dumbledore's gaze. Every time something strange happened at Privet Drive, anything that frightened my uncle, I was punished for it. Every time I tried to understand why I was different, I was told I was wrong, that nothing was different, that I was imagining it. That was part of it too, wasn't it? The family placement. You chose them specifically. Dumbledore's jaw moved slightly. Petunia Dursley is your mother's sister. The blood protection is real, Apolline said, smoothly, because she'd been watching the exchange with precise attention and knew when to come in. We've verified that. What we haven't been able to verify is why the blood protection required the specific environment Harry was placed in. Could you speak to that? Dumbledore looked at Apolline. Then back at Harry. Then at the documentation on the table beside them, which he'd been very carefully not looking at for the past 22 minutes. The table, Harry said. That's Bertrand's work. All 38 blocks, their structure, their timestamps, their function. He paused. The one you're avoiding looking at is the 38th. The oldest one. The one with the secondary function. Silence. What did you put in the deepest block? Harry asked. Dumbledore stood up. Not dramatically, not with any visible agitation. He simply stood and took a slow breath and walked 2 steps toward the table, as if he'd made a decision to look at the documentation directly and was giving himself the space to do it properly. He looked at the top sheet for a long moment. Then he looked up at the chamber, at the 43 council members in the tiered seating, at Seraphine in the matriarch's chair, at Apolline, at Harry. A Horcrux, he said. The word dropped into the silence of the chamber like something very heavy dropped from a great height. Voldemort made Horcruxes, Dumbledore said. His voice had changed completely now, stripped of the warmth and the measured cadence, down to something older and harder and more real. Fragments of his soul, stored in objects, to preserve himself against death. When his curse rebounded that night at Godric's Hollow, the fragment that broke free, he stopped. Looked at Harry. It attached to the only living thing in the room. Harry's hand went to his forehead without him consciously directing it. To the scar. He'd had the scar his whole life and it had always just been a fact about him, like his eye color and the shape of his hands and the way his hair never lay flat. A piece of his soul, Harry said quietly. He took his hand away from his forehead. In me. We believed, Dumbledore said, that access to your full power while that fragment remained, the interaction between your own magical core and the Horcrux, unconstrained, could be catastrophic. For you. And for those around you. We, Apolline said sharply. Who is we? Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. Myself. And others I consulted in confidence. And the solution you and your confidential others arrived at, Apolline said, was 38 suppression matrices on a child, rather than removing the Horcrux. Removing it wasn't known to be possible, Dumbledore said. Not without, he stopped. Not without what? Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him. And for the first time in the conversation, Harry saw something behind the half-moon glasses that was none of the earlier things, not the warmth, not the management, not the strategic calm. Something more like the expression of a man standing at the bottom of something he built and seeing, from the ground, how it looked. Guilt, Harry thought. Not performed guilt. The real kind. Not without destroying the Horcrux, Dumbledore said. Which would have required destroying what it was attached to. The chamber took a moment to understand this. Harry understood it immediately, because Harry was fast and because he'd been preparing himself for large pieces of information for 2 days. He was quiet for a long moment. "You thought you'd have to kill me," he said. "I thought," Dumbledore said, very quietly, "that it might come to that. Eventually. When the time was right. I am not certain. But it was a possibility I could not rule out." He looked at Harry with the expression of someone who has decided to stop managing a conversation and just be in it. "The blocks were partly to suppress the interaction between your core and the fragment. To prevent the fragment from becoming active. To keep you, yourself. For as long as possible." "For as long as possible," Harry repeated. "Yes." Harry looked at him. He was doing what he always did with large, complicated pieces of reality, looking at them directly, not looking away. This particular piece was very large and very complicated and he looked at it anyway. "So 38 blocks," Harry said. 8 years with the Dursleys. A cupboard." He paused. "To keep me contained, untrained, controllable, alive only until you needed me to not be alive." He said it without rage, without any performed emotion at all, which made it more devastating than rage would have been. "That's what this was." "No," Dumbledore said, with more force than he'd used in the entire conversation. "Not that simply. Never simply. Every decision I made was," he stopped himself. "Tried again. I love you, Harry. I have since your parents died. What I did was done out of," "You don't get to use that word right now," Harry said. Dumbledore fell silent. "Not because it isn't true," Harry said. "It might be true. I don't know you well enough to know if it's true. But you don't get to use the fact that you love me as an argument for why you put 38 blocks on me before I could talk." He looked at Dumbledore steadily. "Those are two separate things." The chamber was absolutely quiet. In the tiered seating, nobody moved. Seraphine had not said a word in 40 minutes. Apolline let the silence run for exactly as long as it needed to, which was long enough to make the chamber feel the weight of it, before she spoke. "The Horcrux," she said, her voice precise and level. "Our healers will need to assess Harry. To determine what's actually there, its current state, what the removal of the blocks has done to the interaction between his core and the fragment." She looked at Dumbledore. "Did you intend to share this information with us today?" "I wasn't certain what you knew," Dumbledore said. He sat back down. He moved differently now, not the unhurried deliberate ease of his arrival, but heavier. More present. "I came today intending to, yes. To tell you. If the blocks had been removed, you needed to know." "When were you going to tell Harry?" Apolline said. A pause. "When he was older." "How much older?" Another pause. "Longer." "When it became necessary," Dumbledore said, which was an honest answer, and everyone in the room knew it, and it was not a good answer. Apolline looked at him. "Albus Dumbledore," she said, "I am going to say something to you that I want the council to hear, and I want you to hear it clearly." She folded her hands in her lap with the calm of someone who has decided exactly where this is going. "You are one of the most gifted wizards alive. Your record of opposing dark magic is real and significant and I don't dispute it. The problem before us today is not your intelligence or your courage or even your intentions." She paused. "The problem is that you looked at a 15-month-old child and made decisions about his entire life, what he would know, what he would feel, what he would be, because you decided your judgment outweighed his right to be himself. And you made those decisions without telling anyone who might have disagreed with you. Dumbledore was very still. That's not love, Apolline said. That's management. And you are very, very good at it. The chamber was quiet. I know, Dumbledore said. It was such an unexpected response that the chamber took a moment to absorb it. Not deflection, not argument, not a new narrative. Just those two words in a voice that had lost all its management. I know, he said again. I've known it for some time. Knowing it doesn't, he looked at his hands. I made choices I believed were necessary. I would make some of them again. Some of them, he looked at Harry. Some of them I would not. Which ones? Harry said. Dumbledore met his gaze. The family, he said. Placing you with the Dursleys, I told myself the blood protection required it, and it does, but the specific circumstances, he stopped. I knew Petunia Dursley. I knew she was frightened of magic. I made a judgment that frightened was manageable. I was wrong. Harry was quiet. He was doing the thing he did, looking at this directly, not looking away. This piece was about the cupboard and the sellotape on his glasses and being told he was nothing for 8 years, and he looked at it without flinching. That's one, Harry said. What else? Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. The amount, he said. 38 was, the number grew. I told myself each addition was necessary. I may have been more afraid than necessary. Of what you would become before I could guide you. He paused. Of what you would become, period. I may have been afraid of that. Of me, Harry said. Of what was in you that I didn't understand, Dumbledore said. Which is not the same thing, but, he stopped. To you it would feel like the same thing. Yes, Harry said. It would. The conversation had moved somewhere neither of them had planned for, and Harry was aware of it, aware that the chamber was watching something more real than what had been expected, and that Dumbledore's honesty was both genuinely significant and potentially still strategic, because a man who was very good at management would know that genuine honesty was sometimes the most powerful management tool available. He held both of these things simultaneously. He was 8 years old and he was doing it and he knew he was doing it. The Horcrux, Harry said. What do I do about it? Dumbledore's expression shifted. There are possibilities that I had not considered until recently. Certain areas of research. He stopped himself, and Harry saw him making a decision. I will share everything I know. With you and with Healer Fontaine, if she's willing. I won't, I'm not going to hold that back. Not now. Why now? Apolline said. Why the full disclosure now and not 2 days ago? Dumbledore looked at Harry. Because 2 days ago Harry was a child I had managed for 8 years, he said. Today he's clearly someone else, and pretending otherwise would be, he paused. Inefficient. Harry almost smiled at that. Not because it was funny, but because it was an honest answer from someone who thought in those terms and knew it. I want the research, Harry said. Everything you have. All of it. You'll have it, Dumbledore said. And I want to be in every conversation about what comes next. Not told about it after. In it. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once, simply. And the third thing, Harry said. Third. I'm not going back to the Dursleys, Harry said. Dumbledore's gaze moved to Apolline. Something passed between them, not a challenge, more like two people confirming the new shape of a territory. I see the guardianship has already been filed, he said. Yesterday afternoon, Apolline said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, the blood protection. If Harry is not in proximity to Petunia Dursley, we're aware of the parameters, Apolline said. We'll manage them. The protection can be maintained through periodic proximity, it doesn't require Harry to live there. Dumbledore nodded. Slowly. It was the nod of someone accepting a thing they'd thought was theirs and finding it had changed hands, and deciding not to argue about it. Harry watched him make that decision and thought that it was probably the most honest thing he'd seen Dumbledore do yet. Seraphine spoke for the first time in nearly 2 hours. "You'll stay tonight," she said to Dumbledore. It was not a question. "There are matters that need to be discussed with the full council. You'll present your research documentation in the morning." Dumbledore looked at her. "Of course," he said. "And the International Confederation notification, I understand it's been sent," Dumbledore said. "I won't contest it. Whatever process is required." His voice was steady. Whatever he felt about the notification, he was not performing distress. "I have done things that require accountability. I understand that." Seraphine held his gaze for a moment. "You do understand," she said, as if confirming a calculation. "That's what makes you interesting, Albus. You've always understood. You understand and you proceed anyway, because the understanding doesn't change what you've decided is necessary." She was very dry about it. "A quality I recognize. It's the same one I use." Dumbledore looked at her. "Yes," he said. "I imagine it is." Something passed between them that Harry didn't entirely understand, the acknowledgement of two people who operated in the same mode and knew it, who found each other comprehensible in a way that was not friendship and was not entirely antagonism either. Then Seraphine looked at Harry. "You did well," she said. Not warmly, but genuinely. Harry met her gaze. "You told me to let the council lead until I had the opening," he said. "You were right. I waited." "You waited," Seraphine agreed. "And then you didn't need an opening. You made one." Harry looked at her. "The wardship motion," he said. "You're going to try again?" Seraphine's expression didn't change. "The guardianship filing will be challenged. Legally. Through proper channels." "Yes," Harry agreed. "And Apolline will defend it. Through proper channels." He paused. "I'm not your asset, matriarch. But I'm not your enemy, either. I'm going to be around for a long time. You should probably think about what you want that to look like." Seraphine looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood, and the session dissolved, and Dumbledore was escorted out by Apolline while council members filtered around them, and Apolline moved to stand beside Harry and said nothing because there was, for the moment, nothing more to say. Harry found his way to the garden as the afternoon got long and golden. Not the lavender fields, further around, to the east side of the chateau, where there was an old stone wall covered in climbing roses and a bench that caught the late afternoon sun and was probably Apolline's, judging by the book left on it and the half-drunk cup of something cold beside it. He moved the book carefully and sat down. He sat there for a while without thinking about anything in particular, which was unusual for him, because Harry's brain generally preferred to be doing something. But there was something exhausting about the day in a way that thinking couldn't address, and he let himself just sit. In the sun. In a garden. With his feet on the ground and the blocks gone and a day behind him that had been enormous. A Horcrux. A piece of Voldemort's soul, living in his scar, in the thing that made him Harry Potter, coexisting with him for 8 years while 38 blocks held everything at a distance and the Dursleys told him he was nothing. He looked at the roses. They were very red, climbing enthusiastically over the very old stone, and they smelled good. It was survivable, he thought. The information was survivable. Everything was survivable until it wasn't, and he was here, and the blocks were gone, and Apolline had filed for guardianship, and Fleur was somewhere in the chateau, and Dumbledore was going to give them his research. It was more than he'd had 3 days ago. "You're thinking very loudly," Fleur said from behind the roses. Harry looked. She was on the other side of the climbing wall. There was a gap in the rose coverage and she'd apparently found the other side of the bench at some point and been sitting there while he didn't notice, which should have surprised him and didn't. "How long have you been there?" he said. "Before you arrived," she said. "This is your spot," he said. It wasn't a question. It's my mother's spot. She doesn't mind me using it. Fleur appeared around the wall and sat down on the bench beside him, pulling her knees up. She looked at him with direct attention. How are you? Harry thought about this honestly. I don't know, he said, which was the truest answer. I know what a Horcrux is now. Fontaine explained it when I went to find her after the session. He paused. It's a lot of information. Yes, Fleur said. She wasn't going to minimize it, which he appreciated. He's in there, Harry said, touching his scar briefly. Voldemort. A piece of him. Has been my whole life. He looked at his hand. And Dumbledore knew. And decided I should live with the Dursleys and be blocked and not know. He paused. Because he thought eventually he might have to kill me to destroy the fragment. So he kept me in the dark and kept me manageable so that when the time came, he stopped. He could make the decision without you in the way, Fleur said quietly. Yes. Fleur was quiet for a moment. Then she said, he said some of what he'd do again. What he wouldn't. Yes. Do you believe him? Harry thought about this. I believe that he believes it, he said carefully. I believe the guilt is real. I also believe that if he'd made those decisions and kept them secret for 20 years, and then sat in that chamber and seen the outcome and decided the honest approach was his best option, I can't know which part of him I'm seeing. He looked at Fleur. Apolline said he deals in narratives. Today's narrative was honest repentance. It might be real. It might also be his best move. That doesn't mean you can't, Fleur started. Trust him a little, Harry said. I know. I'm going to take the research. I'm going to stay in the conversations. I'm not going to turn away from whatever useful things he can offer. He paused. I'm also not going to forget what he decided I was for. Fleur nodded. That seems right, she said. He kept calling me a chess piece, Harry said. Not in so many words. But that was the shape of it. The whole structure was, Harry is a piece, not a player. Put him where useful, move him when necessary, sacrifice if required. He looked at the roses. I'm not doing that. No, Fleur said, with considerable certainty. You're not. Harry looked at her sideways. She was 9 years old and sitting on a garden bench with her knees drawn up and her silver blonde hair loose because the braid had finally given up completely, and she was looking at the roses with the expression she wore when she decided something and wasn't going to undecide it. There's something you haven't asked me about, he said. Fleur didn't look at him. I know. The mate bond, Harry said. Your mother hasn't explained it fully. She said she was waiting until I was more stable. He paused. I think I'm stable. Fleur was quiet for a moment. You are, she agreed. So what is it, he said. What does it actually mean? Between two people. Fleur looked at the roses for another moment. Then she looked at him, and there was the expression, the very honest one, the one where the theatrics went completely away. A Veela bond between mates isn't ownership. Maman explained that. It's not compulsion. It doesn't take away choices. She paused. It's more like recognition. The magic in both people recognizing the other person as home. Not in a tidy way. Not in a way that means everything is simple or easy. She looked at her hands. More like the place where things make the most sense. Harry thought about this seriously. And you feel it? The recognition? Since before you arrived, Fleur said. Since 3 a.m, 2 days ago. I woke up and something was different. And then Maman came home with you and I walked into the medical wing and she stopped. And? Harry said. And it made sense, she said simply. You made sense. Harry held this. Outside the wall, a bird somewhere was doing something pleasant, and the sun was getting lower, and the roses smelled like summer. "I don't know what I feel yet," he said. "That's honest. I've been here 3 days and a lot of those 3 days have been, a great deal has happened." "I know," Fleur said. She didn't seem bothered by this. "I'm not asking you to know yet. But you know." "I know my part of it," she said. "Your part is yours to figure out." A pause. "You'll figure it out. You figure everything out." Harry was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You were in the medical wing for 3 days straight." "I had reasons to be there," Fleur said serenely. "You said those reasons were that I needed someone who wasn't watching me like a case." "I did say that." "Was that the whole reason?" Harry said. Fleur looked at him. The honest expression. "No," she said. "Not the whole reason." "Okay," Harry said. "You keep saying that," Fleur said. "Things keep being okay," Harry said. She looked at him for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed, a real one, surprised out of her, unguarded and genuine, and it changed her face entirely, made her look exactly like what she was, and Harry found himself smiling back at it because it was impossible not to. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said, still smiling. "Just," she shook her head. "You're going to be very interesting to know," she said. "I'm going to try," Harry said, which was also a kind of promise, though neither of them labeled it as such. They sat in the garden until Apolline came to find them for dinner, walking around the rose wall with a look that took in the two of them on the bench and the quality of the silence between them, and said nothing about any of it, just told them it was getting late and the food was getting cold, which was the right thing to say. Harry got up from the bench, and Fleur got up beside him, and they walked back into the chateau together as the evening came down golden and warm over the lavender fields, and somewhere inside, Dumbledore was going over his research notes, and Seraphine was planning her next move, and the council was processing what it had heard, and all of that was real and coming and would need to be dealt with. But right now Harry was 8 years old and walking in a garden, and the blocks were gone, and the sun was warm, and the garden smelled like roses and lavender. He let it be enough for the moment. Chapter 5, Fire and Feathers. 3 days after Dumbledore's arrival, Chateau Lumineuse settled into something that felt, cautiously, like a new normal. Dumbledore had presented his research on the Horcrux in a closed session with Fontaine, Apolline, and 2 senior council healers, and the documentation he'd brought was extensive, decades of work, some of it brilliant, some of it the kind of brilliant that had gone quietly wrong in ways he'd talked himself past because the conclusion was convenient. Fontaine had spent 2 days going through it with the methodical focus she brought to everything, and her preliminary finding, delivered to Apolline over coffee at 6 in the morning because Fontaine did not sleep well when she was thinking hard, was that removal of the Horcrux fragment was possible. Not easy. Not without risk. But possible, and crucially, possible without destroying Harry. Dumbledore had apparently known this was a theoretical possibility for several years and had filed it under the category of things he would examine when circumstances required, which was the category where he filed many things that other people might have acted on sooner. Harry received this information from Apolline at breakfast, while Fleur ate toast across the table and pretended not to be listening very intently. "Possible," Harry said. "Fontaine believes so," Apolline said. "She wants more time with the documentation before she commits to a method. But her instinct is yes." Harry nodded. He ate a piece of toast. He was getting better at letting large pieces of information land without immediately trying to do something with them. "When? She'll have a more detailed assessment in a week, she thinks." "And Dumbledore?" "He's been cooperative," Apolline said, with the specific tone she used when cooperative was doing a lot of work in the sentence. "He's staying until the ICW process begins, which will be 3 weeks, approximately. He and Seraphine have had several private conversations." "About what?" Harry said. Apolline looked at him. "About you, partly. About the political situation in Britain. About the relationship between the ministry and the council going forward." She paused. About the fact that Voldemort's supporters never fully disbanded, and there are indicators that some of them are becoming more organized. Harry turned this over. He's making himself useful, he said. He's very good at making himself useful, Apolline agreed. It's one of his most reliable qualities. Harry ate another piece of toast and thought about Dumbledore moving through the chateau corridors with his grey overcoat and his half-moon glasses, being cooperative and useful and present. He thought about Seraphine having private conversations with him. He thought about the way two very capable people who operated in the same mode, who understood each other, as Seraphine had said in the chamber, in the way that two similar things recognized each other, might find themselves arriving at shared positions that nobody else had been invited into. Your mother is aware of all of this, Fleur said from behind her toast. Apolline looked at her daughter with mild exasperation. I am aware, she said. I have people in all three of those conversations. Fleur looked at Harry. She means she has people who are present and reporting, she said. She has excellent people. I know, Harry said. Celine. The way she listens. Apolline looked at him. I didn't tell you about Celine. No, Harry agreed. You didn't. There was a brief silence in which Apolline appeared to revise several assessments simultaneously. Then she drank her coffee and said, the council session this afternoon is procedural, the ICW notification response, primarily. You don't need to be there unless you want to be. I want to be, Harry said. I thought so, Apolline said, and stood to clear her plate. The procedural session was exactly what it said it was, and therefore exactly what Harry wanted, the administrative machinery of the situation laid bare, without the high drama of Dumbledore in the room. He sat in the observer's gallery with Fleur and watched the council process the ICW's initial response, which had been prompt and formally expressed and full of the kind of language that meant we are taking this very seriously, while also meaning we are not going to do anything that upsets Britain until we know more. The ICW had, diplomatically, asked for additional documentation and requested a formal meeting in 3 weeks. 3 weeks was a long time, Harry thought. A lot could happen. It was during the procedural discussion about documentation protocols, about 25 minutes in, when the chamber had settled into the slightly lower gear of administrative work, that Harry noticed Aldrich. He'd been watching Aldrich since the first session, in the way he watched things that seemed like furniture and weren't. Aldrich participated rarely in chamber discussions, which was proper for an advisor, but when he did speak it was always at a hinge point, always just after a decision had been made and just before it was acted on, so that his words fell into the space where action began and could shape the direction of that action without appearing to affect the decision itself. He was very good at it. Harry had been studying the technique with genuine interest. Today Aldrich was quieter than usual. He'd said nothing in the session, which was unusual, even by his standards of strategic restraint. He usually found at least one hinge point. He was standing in his usual position behind Seraphine's chair, hands folded, expression professionally neutral, and Harry watched him and felt the thing that he'd been developing since the blocks came off, the sense of the room's magical texture, its undercurrents, the way intention moved through space like weather moving through air. Something was different. He couldn't have said what it was exactly, not yet, not with the vocabulary he was still acquiring. But there was a quality to Aldrich's stillness today that was not the stillness of a man who was watching and waiting. It was the stillness of a man who was waiting for something specific. Harry leaned over to Fleur. How many people in this room are Aldrich's? He said quietly. Fleur looked at him. What do you mean? People who report to him. Or are aligned with him specifically, rather than with Seraphine or your mother. Fleur was quiet for a moment, scanning the chamber with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent childhood in the backgrounds of important rooms. Deschamps, probably. Fournier has been less reliable, I think he's moved toward Maman since the Dumbledore session. Councillors Renard and Havel, definitely. Possibly Councillor Okafor, though she's hard to read. She paused. Why? He's waiting for something, Harry said. Aldrich is always waiting for something, Fleur said, but she was watching him now too, with sharper attention. The session ran its course and dissolved, the council members filing out in the usual small conversational clusters, and Harry stayed in the gallery while the chamber emptied and watched Aldrich exchange 3 words with Hovel on the way out, 3 words, a nod, and a slight adjustment of direction, Hovel falling into step with Renard rather than his usual post-session companions. "Tonight," Harry said. Fleur looked at him. "You think something happens tonight?" "Something's already started," Harry said. "I don't know what yet." He told Apolline as she came to collect them from the gallery. She listened without interrupting, which was one of her better qualities, and when he'd finished she was quiet for a moment with the expression she wore when she was pulling information into an existing pattern. "Aldrich has been pushing the wardship challenge through the Family Registry Tribunal," she said. "Faster than the standard timeline, which means he's pulling strings. I've been watching it." She looked at Harry. "If he has a parallel play, he does," Harry said. "I don't know what it is. But the way he moved Hovel and Renard in the same direction at the end of the session, that was coordination. Something is lined up and he was confirming it was still lined up." Apolline looked at him with an expression that was partly professional and partly something warmer. "3 days ago you'd never attended a political session in your life." "I've been watching people make decisions about me without telling me for 8 years, Harry said. "I got good at reading the setup." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "I'll have Celine increase the internal watch. If something's planned for tonight, we'll see the preparation." It came at 2 in the morning. Harry was awake for it, which was either good instinct or the fact that his magic had been doing something in the small hours since the blocks came off, not disruptive, just present, the way a fire was present in a room even when you weren't looking at it. He lay in the dark and felt the chateau around him, and at 2:07 he felt something change in the quality of the wards on his floor. Not a breach. More like a key turning, something authorized, something that belonged inside the building, but moving with a specific directional intention that was not the random movement of nighttime inhabitants. He was out of bed before he'd consciously decided to move. He was in the corridor pulling on his jacket when Fleur's door opened. She was already dressed, which meant she'd been awake too. She looked at him and said nothing, just tilted her head in a question. "You felt it," he said. "Something's on your floor," she said. "The wards changed." "I know." He looked at the corridor. It was lit by the low nighttime light the chateau maintained, warm stone, floating orbs dimmed to their night setting. Empty. But he could feel it the way he could sometimes feel things now, the magical texture of the space, and there were 2 distinct presences, wasn't quite the right word, but was close, 2 clusters of directed intention moving from the west stairwell toward his room. "They're coming here," he said. Fleur's eyes moved to his door. "For you." "For me specifically," Harry said. He thought about it fast, because fast was what the situation required. "If they wanted to move me out of the building they'd have done it in a way that avoided my floor entirely, gone through administration, through a legal channel. This is," he paused. "This is a ritual. Something that needs to be done to me directly. While I'm here." "A blood binding," Fleur said, and her voice had changed. "Gone flat and hard. Old Veela nation right. You bind someone to the nation's sovereignty through blood magic, it supersedes any guardianship filing, any external legal claim." She looked at Harry. "If it's completed, you'd be a ward of the nation in the oldest, most legally unassailable sense. Even the ICW couldn't touch it." "Aldrich," Harry said. "Aldrich," Fleur confirmed. Harry looked at his door. He thought about going back inside, locking it, letting Apolline's people handle it. He held this option for approximately 2 seconds and put it down. "How does it work?" he said. "The right. They need you present. Cooperating or, not, but present. They need a ritual space prepared, which they'll have set up somewhere in the chateau already, because you can't do it in a corridor, and they need to move you there without." She stopped. Looked at him. "Harry." "Yes." Don't let them get you to the ritual space, she said. Once you're in a prepared ritual space, the wards of the preparation itself create a contained magical environment. Your own power works against you inside it, it feeds the containment. Harry nodded. This was very useful information. Where will they have set it up? The deep cellar, Fleur said immediately. It's the oldest part of the building. The stone retains magical impressions. It's where the nation's original binding rites were performed, historically. She was already moving down the corridor, away from the west stairwell and toward the east wing. Come on. If we go down the east stairs we beat them to the ground floor. Wait, Harry said. She turned. I'm not hiding from them, he said. Fleur looked at him. Her expression was the direct one, the no theatrics one. I know that, she said. I'm not suggesting hiding. I'm suggesting we meet them on ground we choose rather than ground they chose. She tilted her head. There's a difference. Harry considered this. Yes, he said. All right. Let's go. They went quickly and quietly down the east stairs, Fleur moving with the knowledge of someone who'd grown up visiting this building, taking turns without hesitation, and Harry matching her pace because his sense of the building's magical geography was developing fast enough that he could feel which direction was which without needing landmarks. They reached the ground floor at the same time they heard footsteps on the west stairs above them, 2 sets, unhurried, purposeful. The chateau's entrance hall was large and lit by 2 of the floating orbs on their night setting, throwing long shadows across the stone floor. Harry stopped in the center of it. Not because it was a tactically obvious position, it wasn't, really, it was exposed on 4 sides, but because it was open, and open was what he wanted. No corridors, no confined spaces, nothing that could become a prepared ritual environment in the next few minutes. He waited. They came out of the west corridor 1 minute later. There were 2 of them, which confirmed the 2 presences he'd felt, Havel and Renard, both in their council robes, which was either a statement or an oversight. Havel was carrying something, a small case, leather, about the size of a book, held with the careful 2-handed grip of someone transporting something fragile or potent. Renard had his wand out, though not raised, and he stopped when he saw Harry in the center of the entrance hall and his expression went through several rapid changes. Havel stopped too. The careful grip on the case tightened. Harry, Renard said. He recovered quickly, he was a competent man, Harry thought, not exceptional, but competent. You should be in bed. I was, Harry said pleasantly. Couldn't sleep. You. A pause. Renard glanced at Havel, who was looking at Harry with an expression that was recalculating something. We were, Renard started. You were going to my room, Harry said. And then you were going to bring me down to the deep cellar. And you were going to perform the old nation binding rite. He said it conversationally, as if describing a thing he'd read in a book. Is that right? Havel's jaw tightened. How do you, it doesn't matter how, Harry said. The question is whether you're still intending to do it. Because I want to be clear about something. He looked at both of them in turn. I've had people make decisions about what I am without asking me for 8 years. That's over. So if you'd like to try to bind me to the nation's sovereignty without my agreement, you can try. I'd like to see how that goes. He said it mildly. He was standing in the center of the entrance hall with his hands loose at his sides and the night-setting orbs casting long light across the stone, and he was 8 years old and slight and wearing a jacket over his pajamas. Everything about his physical appearance suggested this should not be a meaningful statement. And yet, the entrance hall felt different from when they'd walked into it. The air had the quality it had sometimes had in the medical wing during the block removal, charged, expectant, the ambient magic of the space reorganizing itself around a new gravitational point. The orbs above them had brightened slightly. The shadows had changed. Renard had raised his wand slightly, which was an instinct Harry didn't blame him for and also didn't concern himself with. Harry, Havel said carefully. You don't understand what you're, I understand exactly what I'm refusing, Harry said. Try to be clearer about what you're about to do. Fleur was at the edge of the hall, near the east corridor entrance, and she was not attempting to be invisible. She was standing with her arms folded and watching the two council members with the expression of someone watching a chess game where she already knows the result. Havel looked at her. Something shifted in his approach. She was Apolline Delacour's daughter, and Apolline Delacour was someone whose professional displeasure had consequences. He looked back at Harry. The binding is authorized by the matriarch, he said. Emergency provision. The wardship challenge creates a period of legal uncertainty in which the nation's traditional protections can be. Seraphine authorized this? Fleur said sharply. A pause. She is aware, that's not authorization, Harry said. Havel stopped. She's aware, Harry continued, which means she knew and didn't stop it, which means she wanted it done without her name on it. So that if it goes wrong, it's not her decision. It's yours. He looked at Havel steadily. Does that sound right? Havel said nothing. You're not here for Seraphine, Harry said. You're here for Aldrich. And Aldrich is here because he has a plan that requires me to be a ward of this nation, and the wardship motion failed, and the legal challenge is going to take 90 days, and he doesn't want to wait 90 days. Harry kept his voice level. What is the plan that needs me to be a ward so urgently? The entrance hall was very quiet. Renard had lowered his wand slightly, the instinctive calculation of a man who was reassessing his position with increasing urgency. We were told, Renard said, slowly, that keeping you under council jurisdiction was a matter of national security. That, he stopped. That what? Harry said. Renard looked at Harry. He was doing what Renard types did when they got to the moment where following orders had brought them somewhere they hadn't quite expected, the rapid moral inventory. We were told you'd be used. By the British. By Dumbledore. That without formal council wardship you'd be taken back and used as a weapon in whatever's coming with Voldemort's supporters, and that the nation needed you, needed me under control, Harry said. Protected, Renard said. Under control, Harry said again, with the flat patience of someone who has been through this particular argument and knows where it ends. The argument is always protection. The reality is always control. He looked at Renard directly. I am not a weapon. I am not a ward. I am not a piece on anyone's board. He paused. I'm willing to work with this council. I'm willing to be part of what this nation does about Voldemort's return. But it will be my choice. Not something bound into me without my knowledge at 2 in the morning. Renard and Havel looked at each other. Then they looked at Harry, and at Fleur, and at the entrance hall with its brightened orbs and its charged air, and they made a decision. Havel set the leather case down on the floor. This doesn't leave the hall, he said. To Harry, not to Fleur. No, Harry agreed. Havel looked at him for a moment. You're 8 years old, he said, and it was not what it had been when Dumbledore said it, not management, not deflection. More like a man genuinely trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he'd expected to see. I know, Harry said. You should probably factor that in when you think about what it means that you're the one backing down. Renard made a sound that was almost a laugh, startled out of him, and then looked like he immediately regretted it. He put his wand away. Havel picked the case back up and the two of them turned and went back down the west corridor, footsteps receding, and then there was just the entrance hall and the night-lit orbs and Harry and Fleur. Fleur exhaled. Right, she said. Get Apolline, Harry said. She's already coming, Fleur said. She'll have felt the magical surge in the entrance hall. She paused. Harry. He looked at her. The magical surge, she said carefully. That was you. The orbs, the air, that was your presence, uncontrolled. Not uncontrolled, Harry said, because that was the honest word for it. Just, present. I wasn't trying to push anything. I was just, there. Fleur looked at him with the expression. The very honest one. I know, she said. That's what I mean. Apolline arrived in the entrance hall 4 minutes later with Celine behind her and the look of someone who had been woken up and had moved from bed to battle ready in approximately 30 seconds, which Harry was beginning to understand was just who Apolline was. She looked at Harry. At Fleur. At the empty entrance hall. Havel and Renard, she said. Yes, Harry said. Blood binding. The old nation right. And? They left, Harry said. The case is in my room. I asked Fleur to bring it up after they went. It has the ritual preparation materials. You'll want to document them. Apolline looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Celine. Wake Vasiliev, she said. And find Aldrich. Celine was already moving. He won't be in his room, Harry said. He'll have moved somewhere. He can have been elsewhere all night. He'll have an alibi. I know, Apolline said. She was doing the rapid assessment she did, pulling the situation into a shape she could work with. But Havel and Renard will have the case, and the case has his preparation work on it, because Aldrich is the one who knows the old rites well enough to have prepared that correctly. His signature will be on it, Harry said. Yes. She looked at him. Are you all right? Yes, Harry said. He meant it. He was very awake and very present and entirely fine. Apolline, Renard said Aldrich told them I'd be used as a weapon by Dumbledore and the British. That without formal wardship I'd be taken back and used in whatever's coming. Is that, Fleur started. Not how I'd have put it, Apolline said carefully. But it's not entirely wrong as a description of the risk. Dumbledore does have significant claim to guardianship of Harry in the British system. The filing I made is strong, but it's new. If the British ministry decides to challenge it, then we deal with that when it happens, Harry said. That's a real problem. But the solution to a real problem isn't to bind me without my consent. He looked at Apolline. Aldrich's not wrong about the danger. He's wrong about his solution. Apolline looked at him steadily. Yes, she said. Exactly. So the answer, Harry said, is to make the filing more solid. To make it harder for the British ministry to challenge. He paused. How do we do that? Apolline was quiet for a moment. She had the expression of someone who had already been working on this and was reassessing the timeline. The ICW meeting in 3 weeks, she said. If we can get formal international recognition of the Veela nation's jurisdiction in this case before the British ministry has formally objected, it becomes the established position. She paused. We need Harry to be present at the ICW meeting. I will be, Harry said. They'll have questions for you, she said. Personal ones. About the blocks. About Privet Drive. I know. It won't be a pleasant experience. None of this has been a pleasant experience, Harry said. I'm still here. Apolline looked at him for a moment. There was the warmer thing in her expression again, the one she didn't always manage to keep professional. Yes, she said. You are. She looked around the entrance hall, at the still elevated magical ambience of it. Did you do that? She said, gesturing vaguely at the brightened orbs. Not on purpose, Harry said. But not accidentally either, he said honestly. It was just what the room needed to be. For what was happening. Apolline processed this. Fontaine needs to know, she said. About your ambient output. Now that the blocks are off and things are, she searched for the word. Settling, Fleur offered. Settling, Apolline agreed. The full assessment of your capabilities needs to happen. Properly. Harry nodded. Yes. But tomorrow. He looked at the entrance hall, at the ordinary nighttime quiet of it now, the orbs returned to their normal setting, the stone floor and the long shadows. Tonight I'd like to sleep. That, Apolline said, seems entirely reasonable. She found Aldrich at breakfast. Harry watched from across the large dining room. He'd arrived early, specifically for this, and had chosen a seat with a clear line of sight to the door, which Apolline had also chosen, for presumably similar reasons. When Aldrich came in at 7:45 with the unhurried ease of a man who had slept well and had nothing on his conscience, Apolline was already at the table with her coffee and her expression. The expression was the professional one, the one she wore in council chambers. Aldrich read it. He was good enough to read it immediately, and his face produced an answering professionalism, and they had a conversation at normal volume while the rest of the breakfast room continued around them, and Harry watched it from across the room and could not hear a word of it, and didn't need to. He could read the mechanics. Apolline presenting what she had. Aldrich acknowledging nothing directly while also not denying anything that would be demonstrably false. The negotiation of position, Apolline making clear what she intended to do with the documentation, Aldrich assessing what was salvageable, both of them conducting this in the practiced way of people who had done similar things many times in different configurations. Fleur appeared with 2 plates and set one in front of Harry without asking. She sat down and looked at her mother and Aldrich. "She has him," Fleur said, with the simplicity of long observation. "Yes," Harry agreed. "He's deciding whether to fight or reframe." "He'll reframe," Fleur said. "He's not a fighter. He's a builder." She ate a piece of fruit. "He'll try to make this into something he did for good reasons and that went wrong in the execution. He'll separate himself from Havel and Renard." "Throw them under," Harry said. "Not cruelly," Fleur said, with the precision of someone who understood the distinction. "He'll frame it as good people acting on incomplete information. Not his fault they went further than he." She stopped. "Then he intended," Harry said. "Yes. And Apolline won't accept that framing," Fleur said. "But she'll let him think she has. She needs him to think the conversation ended in a stable place so she can use what she has when it's most effective." She paused. "She'll use it at the ICW meeting. In front of people who matter." Harry ate his food and watched Apolline end the conversation with Aldrich with the professional pleasantness that meant it was done, and Aldrich left the dining room with the carefully maintained ease of a man who was reassessing several things simultaneously and refusing to show it. Apolline came across the dining room and sat down with her coffee. She looked at Harry and Fleur looking at her. "He folded," Harry said. "He rearranged," Apolline said. "There's a difference. He'll be cooperative until the ICW meeting. After that," she shrugged. "After that it depends on what the ICW decides and where Seraphine lands." "Seraphine knew about last night," Harry said. "She knew," Apolline confirmed. "She also had nothing officially to do with it. That's how she works." She sipped her coffee. "I had a conversation with her this morning before breakfast." "About?" "About the fact that I have documentation placing Aldrich's preparation on the ritual materials. About what I intend to do with it." She looked at Harry. "I also told her something else." Harry waited. "I told her that what she's been trying to do, make you an asset, position you as leverage, isn't going to work. Not because I'll prevent it." She set down the coffee cup. "But because you're going to make it not work yourself, every single time, and that burning resource on something that keeps failing is a bad use of her capacity. She's better than that." "What did she say?" Harry asked. "She said she'd think about it," Apolline said. "Which, from Seraphine, means she already has." Harry was quiet for a moment. He looked at his plate, at the ordinary breakfast, the ordinary morning light coming through the dining room windows. Outside, the lavender fields were catching the early sun, and somewhere in the building Dumbledore was going over notes, and somewhere else Fontaine was working on the Horcrux research, and in 3 weeks there was an ICW meeting, and beyond that, Voldemort's supporters, and a prophecy, and a world that didn't know he was here yet. "What does Seraphine actually want?" he said. "Not for me specifically. In general. What does she want for the nation?" Apolline considered this. "Safety," she said. Position. She wants the Veela nation to be untouchable, to have the international standing and the political relationships and the demonstrated strength that means no one ever decides they can afford to move against us. She paused. She watched the last war. She saw what happened to communities that didn't have those things. So she's afraid, Harry said. She's experienced, Apolline said. Which is a kind of fear, sometimes. Yes. Harry nodded slowly. Then she and I want the same thing, he said. Just differently. Apolline looked at him. What do you mean? She wants the nation to be untouchable through position and leverage, Harry said. I want to not be a chess piece. Both of those things require the same outcome, a situation where nobody has enough control of the situation to use the people in it. He looked at Apolline. If I go to the ICW meeting and I speak for myself and I'm, what I am, in front of those people, then nobody gets to define me. Not Dumbledore, not the British Ministry, not Seraphine, not Aldrich. The nation benefits from that because it means their Mate-Call response is associated with something powerful and independent, not something they're managing. He paused. Tell her that. Apolline looked at him for a long moment. Fleur had stopped eating and was watching Harry with the expression that she'd had in the entrance hall last night, the very direct one, the no-pretense one. You worked that out this morning? Apolline said. I worked it out in the entrance hall, Harry said. When Renard said what Aldrich told them. About me being used as a weapon. He looked at Apolline steadily. Everyone is afraid of what I'll be used for. Dumbledore blocked me because he was afraid. Aldrich tried to bind me because he was afraid. Seraphine wants to ward me because she's afraid. He paused. The only way to stop being the thing everyone's afraid of losing control of is to not be controllable. And the way to not be controllable, Apolline said slowly, is to be clearly, demonstrably yourself, in a public and internationally witnessed context, so that the record shows you as an independent entity before anyone gets to define you otherwise. Yes, Harry said. Apolline was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at Fleur. Stop looking like that, she said. I'm not looking like anything, Fleur said, with the serenity of someone who is absolutely looking like something. You're looking like me, Apolline said, when your father says something that changes how I understand a problem. She looked back at Harry. I'll speak to Seraphine. She picked up her coffee. After breakfast. The full assessment Fontaine had mentioned happened 2 days later, in the medical wing, with the floating orbs at full brightness and Bertrand's documentation folio open beside her. It took most of the morning. What emerged from it was not a neat list of capabilities. Harry's magic did not lend itself to neat lists, as Fontaine noted with the dry tone she used when things exceeded her standard frameworks, but a general picture. His core was, in Fontaine's professional estimation, in the top several % of what she'd assessed in 30 years of working with magically gifted individuals. The Horcrux fragment was present, detectable, and according to her reading of Dumbledore's research, currently in a stable non-active state because Harry's own magical core was large enough and settled enough to simply contain it passively, the way a large volume of water could dilute a small amount of something without being changed by it. It's not harming you, she said. At the moment. But stable isn't the same as safe, and we'll want to address it before it becomes active. When do you think it will become active? Harry asked. When Voldemort is active, she said simply. That's consistent with what Dumbledore's research suggests. The fragment is tied to its source. When the source regains power and presence, then the fragment will too, Harry said. Yes. So we have time, Harry said. But not indefinitely. Not indefinitely, Fontaine agreed. His timeline of return, based on what we know, is years away. But I want a method identified and prepared before that, not after. She paused. I believe I have an approach. I want another week with the documentation before I present it formally. You'll have it, Harry said. He sat on the examination table afterward, after Fontaine had gone to compile her notes, and looked at his hands. He did this sometimes, looked at his hands, in the way that people touched something they'd been given back after it was taken from them, confirming it was still there. The magic in him was present and quiet, like a fire banked down but deep, the kind that could run for a long time on very little and go very bright when it needed to. Fleur was there, of course she'd been in the medical wing assessment as an observer with such complete naturalness that nobody had thought to ask her to leave, and she was sitting in the chair against the wall with one leg drawn up, watching him. "The fragment doesn't bother you," she said. It was somewhere between a question and an observation. "It bothers me," Harry said. "I just don't think being bothered is useful right now." He paused. "It's been there my whole life. 8 years with it and I'm fine. Another few years while Fontaine prepares the removal is the same problem, just with more information." Fleur looked at him steadily. "You said once that everything is survivable until it isn't," she said. Harry thought about this. "I think I said that in my head," he said. "You think very loudly," Fleur said. He looked at her. "Does the bond do that? Let you hear things?" Fleur was quiet for a moment. "Not hear exactly," she said. "More like, feel the shape of. When you're thinking hard about something there's a presence to it." She paused. "I don't know what you're thinking. Just that something is happening." Harry considered this. He filed it not with discomfort but with genuine interest, the way he filed most things about the bond, not avoiding it, not rushing toward it either, just turning it over carefully and learning its shape. "Does it bother you?" he said. "Having that?" Fleur thought about it honestly. "No," she said. I know when you're all right. That's not a small thing." She paused. "Does it bother you?" "No," Harry said, which was true. They sat in the quiet of the medical wing for a while, the afternoon settling into its slower gear, and Harry thought about the ICW meeting in 2 weeks and the Horcrux removal that would follow in its own time, and Voldemort somewhere distant and gathering, and Dumbledore in the chateau corridors being cooperative and useful, and Seraphine processing what Apolline had told her. "Fleur," he said. "Yes." "What does the bond feel like from your end right now?" he said. It was a direct question and he asked it directly because he'd decided that the direct approach was better than the alternative. Fleur was quiet for a moment. She unfolded from the chair and sat down on the edge of the examination table beside him, close but not touching, which was its own kind of deliberate. "Like a door," she said finally. It's always been there, since I was small. A door I could feel but couldn't open because I didn't know what it was." She paused. "And now you're on the other side of it." Harry absorbed this. Outside the windows, the afternoon was golden and ordinary, the lavender fields catching the end of daylight. "I don't know what I feel yet," he said again. He'd said it before. He was being precise about it, not evasive, there was a distinction. "I know," Fleur said. "But I know what I want," he said. "I want this. Being here. Being," he paused, searching for the right word. "Having people. Properly. Not people who manage me or place me or plan around me." He looked at Fleur sideways. "People who are just, there." Fleur looked back at him. The very honest expression. "I'm there," she said simply. "I know," Harry said. He said it the way she'd said it, simply, as pure information, with nothing added to make it more or less than it was. They sat in the warm late afternoon light of the medical wing, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching, both of them 8 and 9 years old and in the middle of more things than most adults ever navigated, and neither of them saying anything more because nothing more needed to be said right now. Outside, the lavender moved in the evening breeze, and the chateau breathed around them, and in the deep stone of the building the old magic settled and held, and Harry Potter sat in it, no blocks, no cages, no one deciding what he was allowed to be, and felt, for the first time in his whole remembered life, exactly like himself. That was enough. For now, it was more than enough. Chapter 6. What comes after the ICW meeting was held in Geneva, in a building that looked from the outside like a moderately ambitious bank and from the inside like the architectural ambitions of every major wizarding culture in Europe had been asked to collaborate and had mostly succeeded. The central chamber had a ceiling that changed with the weather outside, not a charm, an actual opening, fitted with wards that prevented rain and wind while allowing light and air, and 43 delegations sat in tiered seating around a floor of pale marble that had absorbed 300 years of consequential decisions and showed it in the quality of its silence. Harry had been to several significant rooms in the past 3 weeks. He'd been in the Veela Council chamber, in Apolline's salon, in the medical wing during hours that felt like days. He'd sat in rooms where decisions about his life were made and he'd learned how those rooms worked and how to work in them. This one was different. This one had weight. He sat in the Veela nation's delegation box, a curved section of tiered seating with a low carved barrier and the nation's sigil cut into the stone, between Apolline on his left and Vasiliev on his right, which was either genuine regard or deliberate political positioning and was probably both. Fleur was in the row behind with Celine, and Seraphine was in the delegation's front position, and Dumbledore was 3 boxes to the right in the British delegation's seating, which had developed some interesting internal tension over the past week as the British ministry had apparently been doing a great deal of urgent conversation about what, exactly, their official position on all of this was. Harry had watched the British delegation file in and noted that Dumbledore was present but not seated in the delegation's premier position, which he'd apparently held for years. There was a ministry official in that seat, a man named Crouch, according to Apolline's quiet briefing that morning, senior undersecretary to the minister, precise and ambitious and currently occupying the political position of someone who had been handed a very complicated situation and was attempting to turn it into an opportunity. The ICW's Secretary-General opened proceedings at 9, and the first hour was procedural and dense with the kind of formal language that meant things were being done very carefully, which itself was information. When international bodies moved carefully, it meant the people in them were trying to position themselves before the nature of the thing was fully established. The Veela nation's documentation had been formally received. Dumbledore's formal response had been submitted. 3 member nations had filed for observer status on the case. The British ministry had filed a jurisdictional query about guardianship that Apolline had been expecting for 2 weeks. Harry listened to all of it. He'd spent the past 3 weeks doing things that would have been impossible before the blocks came off, not dramatic things, not performed demonstrations of capability, just the ordinary daily work of being fully himself. He'd read everything Apolline's library had on international magical law, Veela heritage and bonding, Horcrux theory, and wizarding political history. He'd had long conversations with Dumbledore that were careful on both sides and useful on both sides and which had left him with a more complete picture of the man than the simplified versions people generally offered. He'd worked with Fontaine every other day on the Horcrux removal plan, which was now formally designed and waiting only for a timing decision. He'd practiced his magic in the East Courtyard every morning because he wanted to know what it could do, and the only way to know that was to find out. He'd spent time with Fleur in the ways that being in the same building and eating at the same table and occasionally finding each other in the library at odd hours naturally produced, and that had been, itself, something that was developing at its own pace in its own direction, without either of them pushing or naming it more than it needed to be named. He felt ready for today. Not because today was going to be easy, it wasn't, and he knew it, but because he'd done the preparation and the preparation had been genuine, and that was what ready actually felt like. The Veela nation's formal presentation came at 10:30. Apolline presented it, which was right. She was the case lead, the investigator, the person who had gone to Privet Drive and found what she found. She was precise and comprehensive, and she laid the documentation before the chamber with the quality she always brought to this kind of work, which was the quality of someone who had complete confidence in the material and was therefore not selling it, just showing it. The 38 blocks. Dumbledore's signature. The physical and magical assessment. The timeline. The Horcrux. She presented the Horcrux information with particular care. It was the piece that changed the political dimension of everything, because a Horcrux meant Voldemort wasn't gone, and if Voldemort wasn't gone, then the magical world's assumption of safety for the past 7 years was built on incorrect information, and that had implications that extended well beyond Harry Potter. The chamber was very still when she finished. The Secretary General asked for questions from member delegations. Several had them: procedural questions, clarifying questions, 2 questions from smaller delegations that were clearly designed to establish where the larger players were before committing a position. Apolline answered them with consistent precision. Then Crouch spoke. He was very good at what he did, Harry noted. He framed his opening with genuine acknowledgement. The British ministry took seriously any allegation of unauthorized magical interference with a minor, was committed to the highest standards of child welfare, had deep respect for the Veela nation's sovereign rights. 3 sentences of ground laying and then the turn. However, the question of jurisdiction in cases involving British magical citizens of minor age is clearly established in existing ICW protocols, and the British ministry would request clarity on the basis by which a foreign sovereign entity has assumed legal guardianship of a British citizen without ministry notification or consent. It was well done. He'd taken the ministry's weakest ground, the fact that Dumbledore, their former chief warlock, had been found to have placed 38 blocks on a child, and moved the argument away from it entirely, toward ground where Britain had a legitimate position. Jurisdictional process. Procedural rights. He'd been working on this for 3 weeks and it showed. Apolline began her response, and it was strong: the Mate-Call protocols, the emergency jurisdiction provisions, the timing of the guardianship filing, but Harry could feel the chamber responding to Crouch's framing, the subtle tilt of the room toward a procedural debate, because procedural debates were where things went to become unresolvable, to sit in committee and be argued about for years. He stood up. It was not a planned move. It had not been discussed, not with Apolline, not with Seraphine, not with anyone. He simply felt the room tilt and knew the tilt was wrong and stood up in the delegation box before his brain had formally authorized it. Apolline's response stopped mid-sentence. The chamber looked at him. The Secretary General was a Swiss woman in her 60s named Burkhalter, with silver hair and reading glasses and the air of someone who had kept order in very difficult rooms for a long time. She looked at Harry with an expression that was not unwelcoming but was carefully assessing. "The chair recognizes," she paused. "Young man, you are Harry Potter," Harry said. His voice carried in the chamber without any effort. He was standing in the second row of the delegation box, visible to the entire chamber, and he was wearing the jacket Apolline had quietly made for him, proper clothes, good cloth, the kind that said you were someone without announcing it, and he was 8 years old and the chamber was looking at him with 43 delegations worth of attention. He did not find this uncomfortable. He found it clarifying. "The subject of the case before this chamber," Burkhalter said. "Yes," Harry said. "I'd like to address the chamber, if that's permitted." Burkhalter looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the chamber's procedures officer, who checked something quietly and said something back. Under ICW Provision 12, a minor at the center of a jurisdictional case may address the chamber with the approval of their legal guardian. Madame Delacour. Apolline, who had sat down the moment Harry stood, said, "Approved," with the tone of someone who had not expected this and had decided immediately that it was right. "You may speak," Burkhalter said. Harry looked at the chamber. He did not look at Crouch, who was watching him with professional attention from the British delegation box. He did not look at Dumbledore, who was sitting very still 3 boxes over. He looked at the center of the chamber, at the marble floor and the ceiling open to the Geneva sky, and he took a breath and said what he'd been thinking about for 3 weeks. 8 days ago, he said, I asked Healer Fontaine what it felt like to have my full magic available to me. For the first time. She said she didn't know. She said it was different for everyone. He paused. What it felt like was like waking up. I've been in this world for 8 years and for all 8 of those years I've been, considerably less than what I actually am. Not by accident. By design. Someone very powerful and very intelligent looked at me as a baby and decided that what I was needed to be reduced, and managed, and contained, and placed in a specific environment for specific purposes. He looked around the chamber. I'm not angry about that today. I was, and I'll probably be again. But that's not why I'm standing up. He was aware of the quality of the room's attention. It was different from the attention that Apolline's presentation had generated, different from the attention on Crouch during his procedural argument. Something more personal. More present. The question before this chamber, Harry continued, is apparently where I belong. Which jurisdiction? Which guardian? Which protocol determines my legal status? He kept his voice level. I want to answer that question, because I've noticed that it's been discussed by a great many people and I'm the only one who hasn't been asked. A pause. I'm 8 years old and I understand that adults make decisions about children and that there are good reasons for that. I also understand that the adults in this specific situation have competing interests in the outcome, which means the one person in the room with no political interest in where I end up is me. Crouch said, with respect, and Harry looked at him directly and the sentence didn't continue. Not because of anything threatening. Not because of any magical pressure, any display, anything that could be called coercion. It was simply that when Harry looked at you with that particular quality of attention, the complete, patient, unmovable kind, the most natural thing was to wait. With respect, Harry said, gently, completing it for him. I know. With respect, I'm a child, and children shouldn't make decisions about their own legal status. That's a reasonable position. He looked at the chamber. It's also the position that left me with 38 blocks and a cupboard under a staircase for 8 years, so I hope the chamber will understand why I'm not entirely persuaded by it. The chamber was very quiet. I want to stay with Apolline Delacour, Harry said. He said it simply, as straightforward fact. Not because the Veela nation has jurisdiction, though it does. Not because the guardianship filing was procedurally correct, though it was. Because she came to Privet Drive because a child was in trouble. Because she told me the truth from the first conversation. Because when she filed for guardianship she told me it meant I wasn't alone, not that I was managed. He paused. That's what I want. Someone who came to help me, not to position me. He looked at Crouch. The British ministry wants me back because I'm useful to them. I understand that. The prophecy, Voldemort's return, the things that are coming, I'm relevant to those things and I know it. But being relevant to a situation doesn't mean I belong to it. I can choose to help with what's coming. I'd rather do that as a person than as a resource. He sat down. The chamber was silent for approximately 4 seconds, for genuine seconds of that particular silence that meant 43 delegations were processing something simultaneously. Then Burkhalter said, in a voice that had acquired a different quality from her opening proceedings tone, "Thank you, Mr. Potter." She looked at the delegations. The chair will take a 30-minute recess. In the delegation corridor outside the chamber, Apolline said nothing for approximately 30 seconds. She stood with Harry and Fleur, and Vasiliev was there too, and Celine, and the 30 seconds had the quality of something settling. Then Vasiliev said, in Bulgarian accented English, that was not in the prepared remarks. No, Apolline said. It was considerably better than the prepared remarks. Yes, Apolline said. Vasiliev looked at Harry with the expression she'd had in the council chamber when he first spoke, the covered mouth, the suppressed something. You know what you did to the procedural argument, she said. Yes, Harry said. I made it irrelevant. Procedural debates are about process. I gave them a person. You can't resolve a person procedurally. Vasiliev looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Apolline. He's right. She said it the way one states mathematical facts. Crouch can't press the jurisdictional process argument now. It looks like he's arguing for the right to control a child who just stood up and very calmly explained that he'd already been controlled for 8 years. She paused. It would be politically catastrophic. He'll reframe, Apolline said. He's good at it. He'll try, Vasiliev said. But the chamber heard Harry. The chamber is going to vote with what it heard. Harry looked down the delegation corridor. Through the open doors at the end, he could see the Geneva morning, the city going about its ordinary business, people and trams and the distant lake catching the sun. A completely ordinary Thursday morning outside, and in here, decisions being made that would shape, what? His next several years. His whole life. Both, probably. Some of both. He was 8 years old and he was fine. Genuinely fine. Harry. Fleur's voice, quiet, beside him. He looked at her. "You're doing it again," she said. "What?" "Being somewhere else," she said. Not unkindly. "In your head. Going somewhere and thinking." "Good thoughts," he said. "I know," she said. "I can tell the difference." She paused. "What are you thinking about?" "What comes after this," he said. "After the vote. After the Horcrux removal. After," he stopped. "There's a lot of after." Fleur looked at him. "Does that feel bad?" Harry thought about it honestly. "No," he said. "It feels like, mine." He paused, trying to find the word for it. "For the first time it feels like mine. All the after, I get to decide what it looks like. Not Dumbledore, not the Ministry, not Seraphine." He looked at Fleur. "Not even your mother, really, though she'll have opinions and they'll usually be good ones." Fleur almost smiled. "She'll have many opinions," she agreed. "Very many. Very good." "And you?" Harry said. "I'll have opinions too," Fleur said. "I always have opinions. It's essentially my defining quality." "No," Harry said. "I meant, in the after. What do you want from it?" Fleur was quiet for a moment. They were standing in a delegation corridor in the ICW building in Geneva and they were 8 and 9 years old and this was possibly a very large question for the time and location, but it was the right question and he'd asked it. "Hogwarts," Fleur said, and then made a face. "Eventually. I want to go to Beauxbatons, Maman went to Beauxbatons and I want to also." She paused. "But I want," she stopped. Looked at him with the honest expression. "I want to know how this turns out," she said. "All of it. The Horcrux, Voldemort, what you become when everything is properly settled." She paused. "I want to be there for it." "You will be," Harry said. He said it with the same simplicity he'd brought to most important things, not as a grand promise, not as a performance. Just as a fact he was certain of. Fleur held his gaze. "You can't know that," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I want it too. So." He shrugged one shoulder, the casual economy of it. "Seems likely." Fleur looked at him. The honest expression softened into something else, not less honest, just warmer. "You're impossible," she said. "Possibly," Harry agreed, and almost smiled, and Fleur did smile, and the corridor was ordinary and bright and ordinary, and somewhere in the chamber behind them the ICW was figuring out how to resolve a situation that Harry had just made considerably harder to resolve against him. Dumbledore found him during the recess. He came along the corridor alone, no ministry handlers, no British delegation members, just Dumbledore in his grey overcoat, moving with the unhurried deliberateness he always used, and he stopped near where Harry was standing at the corridor window looking out at Geneva. They stood side by side for a moment, both of them looking at the city. "That was well done," Dumbledore said. "Thank you," Harry said. "I'm not certain it was entirely in your best interests, politically," Dumbledore said. "Burkhalter will rule for the Veela nation's jurisdiction, your speech made that inevitable. But Crouch will take that ruling as an insult on behalf of the British ministry, and the ministry will make that felt in various ways for years, probably," Harry said. "Yes. I know." Dumbledore was quiet. "You factored that in?" "Yes." "And decided to speak anyway?" "Yes." Harry looked at the lake in the distance, its surface bright in the morning sun. Because the alternative was letting the chamber decide procedurally, and the procedural debate would have dragged for months, and by the end of months I'd have been defined by the process rather than by myself. He paused. The ministry being annoyed about the ruling is a smaller problem than being a case file for a year. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. You sound, he said slowly, like your mother. Harry looked at him. It was the first time Dumbledore had said anything like this, any direct reference to Lily and James Potter as people rather than as components of Harry's origin story. How? Harry said. She had exactly that quality, Dumbledore said, and his voice had changed, quieter, something real in it. Of seeing the political situation with absolute clarity and then choosing the human response anyway because the human response was the right one. He paused. She was also, in my experience, extremely difficult to manage, which was occasionally inconvenient and almost always correct. Harry turned this over. You miss her, he said. Every day, Dumbledore said. Simple, unmanaged. Both of them. Your father had your instinct for a room, he could walk into any situation and understand its mechanics within minutes, which made him exceptional and occasionally infuriating. He was quiet for a moment. They would have been, proud doesn't quite cover it. They would have been astounded and proud and very relieved. Harry looked back at the lake. There was something in his chest that was complicated and large and had been there since Dumbledore first said his parents' names in the council chamber, and he was not going to look at it fully right now because right now was not the time, but he acknowledged it was there. I need to know more about them, Harry said. Who they were. Not the war story. Not the prophecy. Who they actually were. I know, Dumbledore said. Yes. I can do that. A pause. Harry, I want to say something. Say it, Harry said. What I did to you was wrong, Dumbledore said. Not in the careful, contextual way I explained it in the council chamber, I meant that explanation, the context is real and the fear was real. But those things don't make it right. I made decisions about your life that I had no right to make, and I made them because I believed my judgment was more important than your autonomy, and that belief was, he stopped. It was arrogance. Very careful, very well-intentioned arrogance, but arrogance. He looked at Harry. I'm sorry. I don't expect that to repair anything. I wanted to say it without the chamber watching. Harry looked at him. He looked at the old man with his half-moon glasses and his accumulated years and his genuine guilt and the careful intelligence that had built the cage Harry had lived in and was now, genuinely, Harry thought, genuinely, sorry about it. I heard you, Harry said. He didn't say it's all right, because it wasn't, not yet, and he was not going to offer forgiveness he didn't yet have to give. But he heard it, and Dumbledore heard that he heard it, and that was honest. Dumbledore nodded once. The Horcrux removal, Harry said. Fontaine's ready. I want you in the room. Dumbledore looked at him with something that was not quite surprise. Your research made it possible, Harry said. I'm not pretending it didn't. You should be there. He paused. And I want you to see what it looks like when it's done right. Dumbledore was very still for a moment. Then, I'll be there. Good, Harry said, and turned from the window as the recess ended and the delegations began filing back into the chamber. Burkhalter's ruling came at 2 in the afternoon, after 3 more hours of testimony and argument and one very long procedural debate between the German and French delegations that Harry suspected was not really about the issue at hand. The ruling was what Vasiliev had predicted, formal recognition of Veela nation jurisdiction under the Mate-Call emergency protocols, confirmation of Apolline Delacour's guardianship filing as legally valid and internationally recognized, and a requirement that the British ministry work through international channels for any future custody claims, which was the international body's polite way of saying you do not get to simply take this child back. The vote was 31-12. Harry noted which 12. Crouch accepted the ruling with the professional grace of someone who had already identified his next 3 moves and was not bothered about this one. He would be, Harry thought. Later he would be. But for now the grace was genuine enough. Seraphine, in the Veela delegation box, was absolutely still and absolutely unreadable, which Harry had come to understand meant she was satisfied. Apolline, beside him, exhaled, a small sound, controlled, the kind of exhale that contained a very large amount of something that had been held tightly for 3 weeks. Harry looked up at the open ceiling, at the square of Geneva sky above the chamber, blue and very ordinary, the way all skies were when they weren't doing anything dramatic. The reception afterward happened in the building's main atrium, a space of glass and stone and considerable catering, where delegations mixed and spoke in the particular mode of people who had just been formally opposed to each other and were now returning to the normal diplomatic texture of things. Harry moved through it with Apolline, who knew a remarkable number of people, and Fleur, who was managing the atrium with the quality she sometimes had of being entirely in her element without having to try. Several people introduced themselves to Harry. Most of them were cordial and several of them were genuinely curious in ways that were about him as a person rather than as a case study, which he appreciated and responded to with the directness that was increasingly just his natural mode. A woman from the Bulgarian delegation, older, with the quality that several senior Veela had of looking ageless in a specific way, caught him near the end of the reception and shook his hand with the grip of someone who was testing something and expected to find it worthwhile. "You spoke well today," she said, in English with a heavy accent. "Thank you," Harry said. "You understand what you are," she said. "Many people with your heritage never do. They spend years apologizing for it." She looked at him steadily. "Don't apologize for it." "I don't intend to," Harry said. She nodded, satisfied, and moved away. Fleur appeared at his elbow. "Who was that?" "No idea," Harry said. "She told me not to apologize for what I am." "Good advice," Fleur said. "I thought so." Crouch found him near the exit, which Harry had expected. Crouch was not a man who let a setback stand without a next move, and Harry was the most accessible version of a next move in the room. He was accompanied by a ministry official Harry didn't know, and his approach was pleasant and measured. "Mr. Potter," he said. "A remarkable presentation today." "Thank you," Harry said. "I hope you understand the ministry bears you no ill will," Crouch said. "Our concern has always been for your well-being and safety. We'd hope that as you get older," he paused, crafting the sentence with care, "that you'd see the value of a closer relationship with the British magical community. With those who knew your parents. Who have been fighting for the right thing since before you were born." Harry looked at him. Crouch was mid-40s, precise, with the eyes of someone who calculated very quickly and usually correctly. He wasn't wrong about everything he'd said. The British magical community was real and had history, and Harry's parents had been part of it, and he wasn't dismissing any of that. "I'm going to be part of the British magical community," Harry said pleasantly. "At 11 I'll go to Hogwarts. I'll be in Britain for most of the year. I'll have a relationship with the ministry, I'm sure of it." He held Crouch's gaze. "The question isn't whether I'm connected to Britain. The question is what kind of connected." He paused. "I'd like it to be the kind where I'm a person, not a resource. If the ministry can manage that, we'll get along well." Crouch looked at him. The calculation was happening behind his eyes, rapid and thorough. "Of course," he said finally, with the professional grace he'd used all day. "That's all we want." "Good," Harry said. "Then we agree." He moved away. Fleur was waiting 3 steps back with the expression of someone who has just watched something moderately entertaining. "That was extremely polite," she said. "It was genuine," Harry said. "He's not a bad person. He just works for a system that thinks of me as a piece." "And you told him you weren't." "I told him what I'd accept," Harry said. "That's different. If he acts accordingly, everything's fine. If he doesn't, we both know why." Fleur looked at him. "You're going to be extraordinary at Hogwarts," she said. 3 years, Harry said. 2 years and 9 months, Fleur corrected. September. She paused. I'll be at Beaux Batons by then. For 2 years before you go to Hogwarts. Harry looked at her. He hadn't thought about this, the specific gap, the 2 years between her starting Beaux Batons and him starting Hogwarts, when they'd be in different countries at different schools. He turned it over. That's fine, he said. Is it? Fleur said. The honest expression. Not asking for reassurance, asking for the actual answer. Yes, Harry said. We know each other now. That doesn't stop because we're at different schools. He paused. And the bond doesn't require proximity, Fleur said. It's not, it doesn't switch off. Right, Harry said. So. He shrugged. 2 years, 9 months. And then I'm at Hogwarts and you're at Beaux Batons and we're, still this. Fleur held his gaze. Still this, she said, and something in her expression settled, the braced quality that she sometimes had, the preparation, going away and leaving just the honest version of her face. Yes, Harry said. They flew back to the chateau that evening, not apparition, because Harry had quickly established that he preferred broom flight to any other form of magical travel, which had initially surprised and then delighted Apolline because she was an excellent flyer herself and had been looking for a reason to take out the good brooms. They flew south through the cooling evening, the Alps below them catching the last light, and the Provençal hills coming up green and gold ahead, and the lavender fields eventually visible as they descended toward the chateau's eastern approach. Harry flew level with Apolline, who had been quiet for most of the flight in the way she was quiet when she was thinking, and as the chateau's towers appeared below them she said, "How do you feel?" "Ask me something else," Harry said. "I always say fine." "Are you fine?" "Yes," Harry said. "But that's not the interesting answer." He looked ahead, at the chateau coming up through the evening. "I feel like I know what the next 3 years look like, roughly. And what comes after that? Not every detail. But the shape." He paused. "That's new. What does the shape look like?" Apolline said. Harry thought about it. "Like mine," he said. "Complicated and large and full of things that will be hard, but, mine. I get to decide what to do with it." He paused. "That's the difference. Before, the shape was someone else's. Now it's mine." Apolline was quiet for a moment. The chateau was directly below them now, the landing approach clear. She looked over at him, at this 8-year-old boy flying beside her through the Provençal evening with the steady certainty of someone who had been given back themselves and knew exactly what to do with that gift. "You know," she said, "when I knocked on that door 3 weeks ago, you expected someone who needed rescuing," Harry said. "I expected a child who needed help," she said, with precision. "Which is different from rescuing. Rescuing implies someone passive being acted upon. Help implies partnership," Harry said. "Yes." She looked at him. "I expected to help a child. I did not expect the child to be, what you are." "What am I?" Harry said. He asked it genuinely, not as a challenge. Apolline considered. "Someone who was reduced deliberately," she said carefully, "and who, the moment the reduction was removed, became themselves with completeness. No gradual emergence. Just, yourself, fully, as if you'd been waiting for exactly the right moment and had decided this was it." She paused. "It's remarkable. Most people spend their entire lives trying to arrive at that." Harry looked ahead at the chateau. "I've had 8 years of practice knowing what I wasn't," he said. "Made it easy to recognize what I was when I finally got to be it." Apolline said nothing to that, because it was complete in itself. They landed in the east courtyard, Harry first, cleanly, because he'd been practicing the landing approach every morning and had it right now, and Fleur was waiting at the courtyard gate because she'd opérat with Céline and had been home for half an hour, and she had the look of someone who had been waiting with reasonable patience and was now done waiting. "How did the flight go?" she said. "Well," Harry said. "You practiced the landing." Every morning. I know, Fleur said. I watch from the library window. She said it completely without embarrassment, as simple information. Harry looked at her. How's the view from the library window? Good, Fleur said serenely. Come inside, dinner's starting. 2 weeks later, Fontaine completed the Horcrux removal. It was not the most dramatic thing that had happened in the medical wing over the past month, though in purely magical terms it was possibly the most complex. The preparation had been meticulous, Dumbledore's research, Fontaine's design, a team of 4 healers, the room warded 3 layers deep. Harry had read everything and asked everything he wanted to ask and arrived at the appointment with the same quality he brought to most things, which was the quality of someone who had decided what the situation required and was prepared to give it. Dumbledore was in the room. He stood in the far corner, against the wall, and he watched with the expression of a man who had spent years believing something was impossible and was now seeing the evidence of his error presented in real time. He didn't speak during the procedure. When it was done he was very still for a long moment. What happened during the actual removal was something Harry would have difficulty describing afterward. Not because it was traumatic, it wasn't. It was disorienting the way removing something lodged deeply and long was disorienting, the sense of a space where something used to be, the adjustment of weight and balance. The fragment came out with the quality of something that had never properly belonged where it was, not a fight, just a wrongness ending. Afterward there was a long moment where the room was very quiet. Then Harry breathed out. A long breath, slower than usual. He looked at the ceiling. Done, he said. Done, Fontaine said. She ran her diagnostic wand over him with the thoroughness of someone who was checking and double-checking and triple-checking. Everything is, she paused. Clean. It's clean. Harry sat up. He looked at his hands. Then at the room, at Fontaine and her team, at Apolline by the door, at Fleur in the chair against the wall where she'd sat through so much of this. At Dumbledore in the far corner. Thank you, Harry said, to Fontaine, to the team. Then he looked at Dumbledore. Thank you, he said again, and meant it for different reasons. Dumbledore nodded once. His expression was complicated in ways that Harry didn't try to fully read, too many layers, too much history in the man's face. But the guilt was less present than it had been. Replaced by something that wasn't quite resolution but was in its vicinity. Your parents would be, Dumbledore started. I know, Harry said. He let the old man have that sentence, incomplete, because it didn't need to be finished to be true. The evening after the Horcrux removal, Harry sat on the bench in the rose garden, Apolline spot, which had by quiet mutual agreement become theirs, and Fleur was on the other end of it with her feet up, and the lavender fields were silver in the early moonlight, and the chateau was alive around them with the ordinary sounds of a building full of people at evening. He sat there and felt the absence of the fragment and the absence of the blocks and the presence of everything that was actually him, and it was, a lot. A full and real and complicated a lot that he was going to be learning the dimensions of for years. What are you going to do? Fleur said. She was reading something, or had been reading something, the book closed now in her lap. About what? Harry said. About all of it, she said. The things that are coming. Voldemort. The prophecy. She paused. Hogwarts. The ministry. Harry looked at the silver fields. Face them, he said. One at a time, when they come. With the people I trust beside me and everything I actually am available to me. He paused. That's enough of a plan. That's a very minimal plan, Fleur said. It covers everything, Harry said. Fleur considered this with the expression of someone who disagrees methodologically but can't fault the conclusion. It does cover everything, she admitted. Harry looked sideways at her. You'll be at Beauxbatons in 6 weeks, he said. Yes, Fleur said. I'll write, Harry said. Fleur looked at him. You'll write, she repeated, as if testing whether he meant it. Yes, Harry said. Often. Often enough, he said. I'm not sure what often looks like yet. But often enough. Fleur looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the fields. I'll write too, she said. More than often enough, probably. Maman says I communicate at volume. Harry smiled, a real one, the kind he was getting better at having. I'll read everything, he said. Fleur looked at him. Her expression was the honest one, the no theatrics one, the one she only had when something mattered enough for the preparation to drop away. Okay, she said. He looked at her. You keep saying that, he said. Things keep being okay, Fleur said, echoing him exactly, and her expression did the thing where it went from serious to warmth and she looked exactly like herself. Harry laughed. Properly, briefly, the kind that was startled out of him rather than constructed, and it felt easy. Like something that was allowed, that had been allowed all along and was just finding its way out. He sat in the rose garden in the Provençal moonlight and felt the enormity of everything ahead, Hogwarts and prophecies and a world that didn't know what was coming and a dark lord gathering somewhere in the dark in a bond that was still becoming what it was going to be and years of living still to do. He looked at all of it directly, the way he always did, and found it good. Complicated and demanding and full of things that would be hard, and good. 2 days before he was due to start lessons with the private tutor Apolline had arranged, she'd been very clear he was going to Hogwarts prepared, which Harry had no argument with. He went to find Dumbledore. He found him in the chateau's smaller library, the one on the second floor that nobody much used because it was cold and the windows stuck. Dumbledore was at a table with several books open and a cup of tea, and he looked up when Harry came in without particular surprise, because Dumbledore had an excellent sense of rooms. Harry sat across from him. My parents, Harry said. Tell me about them. Dumbledore looked at him for a moment. Then he closed the books in front of him, pushed the tea aside, and settled back in the cold library chair. Your father, he said, was the most talented natural flyer I've ever personally witnessed. He rode a broom like some people breathe. And your mother, he paused, something genuine in his face. Your mother read people the way you do. She could walk into a room and know its entire structure in 60 seconds. It terrified her professors. It delighted everyone who wasn't afraid of it. Harry leaned forward. Keep going, he said. Dumbledore kept going. They talked for 2 hours. Not about the war, not about the prophecy, not about chess pieces and plans and necessary sacrifices. About Lily Evans Potter, who had argued back against every teacher who underestimated her and been right every single time. About James Potter, who had been impossible and loyal and brilliant and had grown into someone extraordinary given the chance. About 2 people who had been young and alive and full of themselves and had made Harry before the world got its hands on him. Harry sat in the cold library and absorbed all of it and said very little, because some things you received rather than responded to, and this was one of them. When it was done, Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. I should have done this sooner, he said. Given you this. Yes, Harry said. But you're doing it now. He stood. We'll have more of these. If you're willing. Willing, Dumbledore said. Something in his expression, old and complicated and moving towards something, slowly, the way a glacier moved. Yes. I'm willing. Harry nodded. Good, he said, and went back out into the warm corridor and down the stairs toward the kitchen where Apolline was probably having her evening coffee and Fleur was probably stealing from it, and the ordinary texture of a household going about its life was in full operation, and he walked into it and was part of it, and it was his. Not given to him. Not placed. Not designed by anyone else's plan. His. He opened the kitchen door and went in.